Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders. Welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode number 80. Today, we're going to be doing a little bit of a mismatch of format today. We're going to be doing some video critiques. People really liked the Scott Bessent interview that I did, but we're going to have an overarching theme, and I'm trying to mash the different formats together. So today, we're going to be discussing what I think is causing the source of much confusion in the world. The world, quite understandably, thinks that we are currently in a trade war between China and America. The reality is, and I'd like to make the case, that the power structure of the world is in fact a battle between BlackRock and China. And I'd like everyone to understand the implications of how the world has changed. And I'm going to do it through the context of covering this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. And in the macro section, I'm going to do one of the video feedbacks to help you because people like that format. So let's see how we get on. But this is going to be Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 80. And if we haven't met already, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 25 years of my life obsessing over the topic of investing and money, and the last 14 years on Bitcoin to try and free as many people from the proof of weapons network, the fiat currency proof of weapons network, a debt-based Ponzi scheme that drives debt slavery globally, and how we can peacefully resist it with Bitcoin proof of work. Proof of work being hard money, money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply. And we're going to be updating on Bitcoin, geopolitics, and macro, as we said. We're gonna jump straight in. So what are we going to be covering today? I'm going to give a short intro on the Bitcoin side. So Bitcoin is now it's approaching the new all-time highs again. I hope you've learned your lessons that I've always taught. Ever since $3 for the last 14 years, I've been saying to everybody to own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. And those that did that, and we have many of them on the channel, have become billionaires. And many people have built significant economic power and are able to combat and beat BlackRock because they built enough economic power to free themselves from the network. So we're going to be covering a few updates that are happening in terms of Bitcoin stable coins and BlackRock capitulating to Bitcoin and what their plan is, and like I would like to share with you. In the macro section, I'm going to cover BlackRock, a bit of understanding how CIA propaganda works. And there is a massive campaign to fool you into thinking that Trump is about to announce a deal with China and that China is about to fall and that Trump has got the China by the balls, essentially, figuratively. I just would like to break down some of the propaganda. So I'm going to go through an interview that I watched the other day that was so obviously military-industrial complex or CIA sponsored propaganda in order to fool people into thinking that this might be something different to what's actually happening in the world right now. That'll be the macro section. And then we're going to go into the geopolitics section. The proof of weapons network. We are really witnessing major changes in the world. This is a once in a generation shift event. Everyone that's been a regular watcher of Bitcoin Hard Talk knows how to analyze these trends. They know how to follow the money. And each week we go through, and now we got a big community of people that all follow the money and understand the methodology. But I would like to share with you how BlackRock is actually ushering in what I covered last week, the multipolar world order, MWO. And notice how after Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 79, there was a lots of content around the world, around the multipolar world order. Starting to notice a lot of that, but it's all good. You know, we are here to communicate and get the message out to as many people. And fortunately, YouTube, the algorithms are changing. We're getting more subscribers. We went through that time of massive shadow banning, massive oppression, and people were subscribing and the number was never going up. But I'd appreciate if everybody that is watching this video, you can wait till the end if you want. But if you hit the subscribe button right now, it will push me through 100K so that I can get it reviewed. And we're smashing through the algorithms right now. It seems like, as I've said, the message that I'm sharing is aligned with BlackRock right now. So the algorithm has kind of shifted. And that's how geopolitics works. It's fluid. Things change. Sometimes you're working with your enemies, against your enemies. And I'll share exactly what I mean right now. So let's do the Bitcoin section. So part one, we're going to go through this week in Bitcoin. And I'm just going to give a few updates and remind you of the dynamic that BlackRock has set up. So firstly, Bitcoin has passed through 100K again. In the FUD campaign, I think it went down to approximately a low of near the previous high around 2021 was about $69,000. And we started to touch into those mid 70s in the recent correction. And now we're back up above 100K again as banks and financial institutions are trying to find as many ways to them owning either your Bitcoin for you by owning it through an ETF or you buying MicroStrategy shares or something like that, or them being able to trick you into selling your Bitcoin so that they can accumulate it. And I think we are seeing the full force of naked shorting, current, options, futures, the whole suite of financial weapons of mass destruction that can't manipulate the price long term, but can certainly do it short term in order to maximize them acquiring a strategic position in Bitcoin, because BlackRock engineered the game when they decided that they wanted to get into Bitcoin, and they got themselves an ETF approved. They managed to do the most successful Bitcoin, the most successful ETF launch of all time. Got many people and the banks and financial institutions into Bitcoin. And then we had a change to the Trump administration. And then we had a change in the world order, the multipolar world order that I'll be covering in the geopolitics section. And now we're getting massive accumulation by financial institutions. For every day for the last 2 weeks, there has been massive inflows from financial institutions acquiring Bitcoin via the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF. So the all-time high of Bitcoin is approximately $109,000. And it looks like, who cares? The lower the price goes, the more Bitcoin you get to accumulate each month with your fiat currency. And because we are valuing our wealth in Bitcoin, or Bitcoin Hard Talk, you want the price to be as low as possible so that you get more Bitcoin for your fiat currency this week. But this particular rally was interesting. It was led by an ETH rally. So we had the Bitcoin creeping up to around about $90,000. And then suddenly we had a massive pump in ETH. And so BlackRock is looking to launch tokenized exchange. And the Trump administration is looking to use World Liberty Financial. And all of the institutions are looking to launch stable coins. And by far the blockchain with the most amount of smart contracts on it is still Ethereum. And it's also got an Ethereum ETF so that BlackRock, when they want to switch to staking, because we're having this new environment with the regulators, they can control more of a proof of stake network like Ethereum. And so suddenly we had a big ETH recovery. I think it went up over 20% in the last day or so. And that drove Bitcoin beyond 100K. So it was led by a Ethereum software update as well. So we're seeing those new short-term trends. And at the same time, we started to get news. So it started around what's going to happen with the Bitcoin strategic reserve. So Cynthia Lummis, and I've been talking about this, was looking at and has introduced a Bitcoin strategic reserve for Treasury. Now, what is an interesting development is, if you remember back in my content, I was saying that I think we're going to go through an attack at the federal level. Because BlackRock is engineering a multipolar world order, one of the strategic games that I've been covering in previous episodes is that the Trump administration basically dismantled much of the apparatus that makes the dollar the world reserve currency. Whether it be NATO by propping up the dollar through the euro dollar, whether it be by USAID funding covert operations that prop up the petrodollar and violence in the Middle East and the global South, whether it be leaving United Nations that props down the global South because it started, suing, for genocide and some of the acts of the US dollar proof of weapons network perpetuated by the Fed and the IMF. And therefore, court cases are coming that may actually end up leading to suing the military companies, Raytheon, General Dynamic, Lockheed Martin, etc., Boeing. And so therefore it started to exit and start to lose some of its soft power there. And it obviously implemented tariff policies. We're even getting things like Hollywood tariffs. Hollywood is obviously a source of American propaganda. So making it where there may be reciprocals means that you weaken the global propaganda of Hollywood. And the global South, gets around it being cheaper to have foreign films. And so all of these are essentially strategically weakening the dollar and pushing America into a regional power so that this can lead to capital outflows into other regions. I'll cover a bit more about that in the macro section. But one of the things that I was predicting is that rather than having a Bitcoin strategic reserve at the treasury level, which strengthens the dollar, and rather than having the Fed accumulate Bitcoin, which strengthens the power of the dollar system and the banks, one of the things I was forecasting is that states would start accumulating their Bitcoin strategic reserves so that when they need to become independent, you can have a decentralizing force. And I think this is something that Americans should be supporting. And so you got a wave of announcements of one of the first states saying the bill was rejected to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And then it led to more and more acceptances. So Arizona was initially said that the bill didn't pass. Then that led to New Hampshire approving a bill. Then it pivoted to Arizona approving a bill. And then it went to Texas. And now 3 states have got Bitcoin strategic reserves. And Texas is obviously an energy producer with much of the Bitcoin mining in America within that industry that has completely transformed the grid, where when there is excess electricity, you can purpose it towards Bitcoin mining and create this very efficient industry that has been happening in ERCOT, in the grid in Texas. So we're starting to see more and more Bitcoin strategic reserve bills at the state level, which I think is a very positive thing for Americans that want to protect themselves from the fact that they're now dismantling, much of the violent power behind the proof of weapons network that was holding the world down in order to perpetuate the unnatural propping up of the dollar. And I want all Americans, Europeans, Brits, that are on the wrong side of BlackRock, as I've shared in these trends, that are being asset stripped right now as our countries are being utilized for the military industrial complex and the profits of the proof of weapons network. They need to start building their decentralized community strategies, whether it be alternative, currencies and Bitcoin strategic reserves. This is how we decentralize and protect ourselves while some of these forces are happening. So it's positive that this is happening at the state level. And America, prior to the central bank and between the central banks, had a state banking system. And it was only when, capitalism was essentially engineered into socialism and eventually communism by creating this unnatural debt-based Ponzi scheme called the US dollar Federal Reserve banking system, where they get to issue credit every time they issue a loan in a system where there's not enough dollars. And then in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto released the white paper. 2009, the code was released for proof of work, and the network grew organically into the largest distributed supercomputer in the world, where now, when I first got involved in 2011, when Bitcoin was $3, wrote the first published book in the world, Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust, and spoke at the first Bitcoin conference in Europe. We essentially, our community, through investing in many different companies and Bitcoin giving companies independence, we built this industry where now essentially BlackRock is capitulating to Bitcoin, which is amazing to what we're saying. But anyway, the US states have, I believe, a historic opportunity to essentially decentralize the way from the federal government as we enter into this multipolar world order. Once you see what BlackRock, what is it essentially is doing to America right now after what it did to Europe and UK as well. And so this is a good way, as I said, to protect their citizens and strip away, from the proof of weapons network that happens at the Federal Reserve level. So what emerges, could be the beginning of a completely more decentralized regional power network where everyone's working on their communities. And I think this is an opportunity that people should be harnessing as well. So New Hampshire has become the first, and this could be a model of strategic Bitcoin reserve bills. And maybe this becomes, the blueprint for how it's done. The one that approved it for the first time, so the person that introduced it was Governor Kelly Ayotte. Sorry if I've said that wrong. But Governor Kelly Ayotte has authorized up to 5% of public funds in New Hampshire to be held in Bitcoin and precious metals as well. And we had similar bills like this that had failed in America. One of them failed in Florida. One of them failed in Wyoming, which is surprising because Wyoming introduced the legislation against rehypothecation and fractional reserve banking, and Montana, but now New Hampshire has approved it. So anyway, this could be how the US evolves, and we enter into a more decentralized version as the federal level goes bankrupt by the Federal Reserve, the proof of weapons network, tariff policies, and all the centralizing forces that BlackRock is pushing the world through right now. And when I say BlackRock, I mean the proof of weapons network. I covered in previous videos exactly how the proof of weapons network works, but I'm going to dig a little bit deeper because I just still think that people don't quite get it. I'll do that in the macro section. They still think that the governments work for them. They still think that the presidents and prime ministers and politicians work for them. They still are confused into thinking change your leadership and you change the course of events. So I want to make sure it is crystal clear today so that people can start thinking differently and how to protect themselves. Anyway, this is one step closer to destabilizing some of the violence behind the Federal Reserve System that was introduced by the Bank of England system. And at the same time, there is that transition towards moving America to a technocracy. Elon Musk was one of the biggest funders of the Trump administration. So was the Mellon banking dynasty, and Adelson, which is the Israeli influence. That made up approximately half or over half of the funding behind Trump. That comes with terms and conditions. And we're starting to see the impact of who paid the most and how more power. So the technocracy side is represented by Elon Musk, and the Trump administration is dishing out stable coins. Now, one of the first rules or laws that needed to be implemented is the stablecoin bill. There was one that was introduced in a rush process called the Genius Act. We covered that in previous episodes. But last minute, this got rejected. And in the rejection letter, you can really look into the letter and try and find out. So remember, in American politics, it's all about lobby. Every politician is a prostitute. You buy the politician in order to exert the corporate interest so that you can pretend it's a democracy. But it's in fact an oligarchy. And at the top of the network, the more money you have, the more economic power you have. Therefore, the more political power you can exert. And you can engineer the whole political process around your particular goals. And because in America and Europe and the UK, the Bank of England, the ECB, and the Federal Reserve, because they get to privatize the money, and it is the shareholders that own the Federal Reserve, the banks, they get to push policy, and they get all the super subsidy from creating the dollar, which leads to massive wealth inequality. And the reason why Bitcoin created a proof of work network where there was a fixed money supply, where banks couldn't influence the supply, and so that people could exit that and boycott the system. Anyway, if you look at the letter of why the stablecoin bill was rejected, and by the way, it's inevitable, it's happening. Don't think that this isn't going to happen. But this is a bit of a political game because there were two things in the letter that they said were the reasons why this didn't pass. The first one was criticizing Trump's meme coin. So prior to becoming president, Trump launched a pump and dump with a developer that was really creating these Solana shitcoins. And this multi-billion-dollar pump and dump Trump coin, meme coin, was launched, which sucks out all the volume from other meme coins and crashed the market. But within the latter, they were really criticizing Trump's meme coin and World Liberty Financial, which is where the Trump family is essentially creating stable coins that pay yield. And so in effect, you're shorting the dollar. And then if you follow the Tether model, you can use that yield from the last remnants of the debt-based Ponzi scheme by backing a stable coin by treasuries. And then the government, when they roll over the debt, they pay out some yield, and then you can use that yield to buy Bitcoin. It's essentially a way of shorting the dollar and going long Bitcoin, but transferring power from the banking system over to the technocrats. And obviously, Elon Musk has been working away on all the technology for his social credit score. But they were criticizing World Liberty Financial, which is launching their own stable coin under the Trump family umbrella, and also the meme coin. So you can see there is a little bit of politics playing out there. You could say that was a bit of a Democrat game in order to hold back policy so that you always have this tug of war while BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network do whatever they want. And they want stablecoins, so it will happen, but this gives a little bit of illusion of some kind of process to distract you, thinking that something else will actually happen. And the other was the banking lobby. So the banking lobby, represented by Elizabeth Warren, where there was language around know your customer regulations on chain. Know your customer regulations, as we've covered many times, are essentially a way of ensuring that there's no competition in the Proof of Weapons Network criminal networks. And so they built this criminal network through the CIA, MI6, Five Eyes, and using the Vatican Bank as an unaudited banking network to acquire banks, where they set up all these money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and weapons trafficking operations. And the Vatican gets a cut of it. Read the book Operation Gladio by Paul Williams if you want to learn more how that actually works. But what it does is KYC laws, which were implemented mainly very aggressively after 9/11, a false flag operation, which was used to justify many of the wars of the Proof of Weapons Network in the Middle East. That led to the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act was the slow removal of constitutional rights if you use the word terrorism, and then they created a fake war on terror in order to print $7 trillion and steal much wealth from the American people by funding these wars that then the money would go back into Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and Raytheon, which would then transfer much wealth over to the money managers that own shares in all these institutions. I'll go through more of that in the BlackRock, in the macro section. But essentially, by implementing KYC, it had a few benefits. It meant that you could prevent competition of money laundering by everyday business that are not in the Proof of Weapons Network, while the Proof of Weapons Network gets a monopoly on the money laundering. And also, it could give you all the data that the tax authorities needed so that they can collect that data and ensure that they're able to implement tax. And obviously, income tax was implemented at the same time as they launched the Federal Reserve. They needed a way to pay that debt because they handed over the privatization of the dollar in a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so you needed income tax in order to facilitate interest payments so that you could continually roll over the debt while you wiped out middle-class America and exported inflation globally through the International Monetary Fund in this network. Well, anyway, they wanted to make sure that there is KYC on chain, which breaks the stablecoin model. I don't think this is where it's going because there are powerful forces that want these stablecoins and they want to use it as a mechanism for rolling over the government debt because America has $10 trillion higher rates. And to take those higher rates, you can skim off all the interest of the out of control debt. and hand over the profits to the stablecoin issuers, which is all the people hanging around the Trump administration, like Howard Lutnick, that's working with Tether, that created the model where Tether is essentially more profitable than Citibank right now because it gets to buy all this Bitcoin with America's debt. Those are all being handed out across the Trump administration. And so, that is the KYC. So I think both of those things that won't matter because I believe that BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network want these things to happen. So they will happen. They just need to strategically reposition, get the legislation at the right time, and set up more of the systems that they want where they can engineer this strategy. Now, before I go through the final stories, I just want to remind you of, if you look back at the Federal Reserve's history, there have been 20 pump and dump schemes which led to the socialization of losses and the privatization of gains, which has wiped out middle-class America. And they are setting up the same system. Now, I'm going to release a blog because yesterday I did a space where victims of that borrowed against their Bitcoin by the IDF soldier and the essentially Alex Majinsky, he had his sentencing yesterday. The DOJ recommended 20 years. He ended up getting 12 years, which is really interesting when you think about it. The reason that the judge gave as the justification is because he served time in the Israeli force, which Israel is a vital weapon of the Proof of Weapons Network. It was created to create violence in the Middle East. And in the geopolitics section, I'm going to show what BlackRock is doing to Israel at the moment, because it was the worst thing that happened to the Jewish people. But I'll cover more of that in the geopolitical section. But anyway, because of the fact that he served in the IDF, in that Proof of Weapons Network, rather than taking the 20 years for the debt-based Ponzi scheme, because he created a Ponzi scheme for $25 billion through the company Celsius, he got a lighter sentence of 12 years. And I went through the whole strategy in depth, which I think there is massive things for you to learn about it. How the Federal Reserve was involved, how Celsius, FTX, SBF, Alex Majinsky, Terra Luna, Gemini, Barry Silbert. I went through all the different players, going through to BlackRock, through the ETF, all the legislation changes, the Biden administration, the Trump administration. So even if you are not a Celsius creditor, I'm going to get a blog out as soon as I can. We recorded the space. I'm going to summarize it on a blog on simondixon.com. And I want you to watch that video when you get a bit of chance, because it is the exact strategy that is being engineered by the banks and financial institutions right now, but it is being done on a bigger scale and a more sophisticated scale. And it utilizes things like Chapter 11 and the legal loopholes in the bankruptcy system. And I went through all of them, and I really want you to be familiar with it, so that as this builds up through organizations like MicroStrategy, 21 Capital, Cantor Fitzgerald, the stable coins, World Liberty Financial, I went through exactly how this would work, and I would like you to study that. But have it be known, here's the TLDR. If you borrow against your Bitcoin, you don't own Bitcoin. You own an IOU of Bitcoin that would require a margin call that could end up in a taxable event and a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. If you own Bitcoin via an ETF, you have an IOU from BlackRock. If you have exposure to Bitcoin through owning a company stock like MicroStrategy, you don't have any Bitcoin. And so if all your exposure is via these mechanisms, and then you take your Bitcoin and you borrow against it, I would want you to know what the risk of that is, so that you can understand how to risk manage it. Because many people, through the what I covered in that, I shared the people that took their life, the people that lost their lifetime savings. It was a 3-year ordeal. And I want to make sure that you never allow that to happen to you, so that if you are engaging in these financial weapons of mass destruction designed to get you and part you and your Bitcoin by leveraging debt and giving you a very compelling pitch of why you should borrow against your Bitcoin to save tax, I want you to understand the full consequences of it. And so I'm not going to go through all of that today, but the TLDR is that if you borrow against your Bitcoin, you don't have Bitcoin. And all of these different mechanisms for parting between you and your Bitcoin means that you're exposed and you need to risk manage that accordingly. And I covered that in depth in the video. So I'll have a blog up there that goes through Mijinski and everything and all the things you need to be aware of. Okay. So stable coins will come, I can assure you, but there's been a bit of a setback. And obviously the timing isn't right. And there's more narratives from the lobby groups in order to get there. But there were a couple of stories, and these are the final ones I'm going to cover in the Bitcoin section. And it's the same day. And this really ties into the multipolar world order that I covered last week. And I'm sure these are completely uncorrelated. But if you've been watching Follow the Money, you don't listen to what politicians say. You don't listen to the narrative that the media gives you, because it's always the opposite. You follow their money, what they're doing with their money, and how capital are flowing. And every week in Bitcoin Hard Talk, I make sure you're on top of those trends. But the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, poured $2 billion into Trump crypto coins. So there was a story, I think it was the Wall Street Journal. I don't know if it's true, but the story came out. And the Wall Street Journal, remember Operation Mockingbird? Operation Mockingbird is when the CIA took over the media and installed these talking heads in order to push narratives to fool you into all of these wars and stuff. Well, the Wall Street Journal was one of the first ones that had a CIA takeover. Look it up on Wikipedia, Operation Mockingbird. But anyway, the Trump, basically, they poured $2 billion into his coin. And so that was either fake narrative to push back the stablecoin side, or there's truth to it, probably truth to it. And at the very same time, the Trump, the Trump administration and the White House decided that they're going to ease restrictions on selling artificial intelligence chips to UAE. So remember what I said. Foreign direct investment means that you give up to foreign control. So all of the deals, and I'll go through this more in the macro section, that Trump is negotiating, it is getting more foreign direct investment, which is essentially the reverse of the IMF model. And if you don't understand the IMF model, look at Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 77, where I deconstructed the Scott Bessent interview, just like I'm going to do in the macro section in a bit. Essentially, there is a big push for foreign direct investment, and they're saying, look, deals are coming, deals are coming. But this is how you strip away control of the country to BlackRock and the financial institutions that are aligned with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Emiratis, the UAE, the Saudis that have built vast wealth, and also BRICS, led by China, that has built out a big manufacturing base and vast, trade surpluses as well, and sovereign reserves as well. And so they're allowing for more and more of that investment. And as I will cover in the macro section and the geopolitical section, all in time for Trump to go visit the UAE, to go visit Qatar, to go visit the Saudis, while major shifts are happening. And there's announcements of new Trump Towers in UAE, Trump Towers in Qatar, Trump Towers in Saudi. So you get the point. There is a strategic shift in capital to a multipolar world order that I talked about in previous episodes. And you can see this at the crypto Bitcoin level, where there is innovation to short the dollar, go long Bitcoin, roll over the debt, make sure that they extract as much Bitcoin out as possible, move to this technocracy powered by a stablecoin social credit score, while Elon Musk and the technocrats all scrape all of the data, and there are massive capital outflows while foreign direct investment asset strips away. Now, is that because Trump wants to do it? Once you understand the BlackRock game, which I will be describing in the macro section in part 2, you can understand, because there is a parallel power structure that sits way above government, and there ain't no president, no prime minister that can go up against that force. because it was created through the Federal Reserve System, and I'll cover that in the macro section as well. But anyway, on the very same day, you got an easing of chips investments ahead of the Trump visit, ahead of $2 billion being invested in World Liberty Financial. As I said, this is the asset stripping of America that is exerted in a MAGA narrative, which is the destruction of Main Street over to Wall Street, because there is a way greater power structure that controls all of our governments. This is what happened in Europe. This is what happened in UK. This is what's happening in Israel. And this is what's happening in America, where assets and governments no longer serve people. They just negotiate these large deals for those that do control the power structure. So I'm going to stop it right there. There are many things. If you have not figured out that Bitcoin is going mainstream, and the banks and financial institutions are trying to get as much of your Bitcoin as possible, then watch the Mizhinsky broadcast that I'll put out there. And please do make sure that you are a free member of Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. That's where you can get a free copy of my book, Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. You can get the video series. I did one in 2009 on the Great Depression of the 2020s to prepare people for a Bitcoin, AI, and CBDC world. I did one in 2019, a 4-part video series, and people prepared all this way for exactly what's happening right now. I'm going to be doing another one early next year as well for 2026 update. These are all free contents for you to prepare. And you can go to simondixon.com and you can sign up for free to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. And we're going to jump over to section 2 in macro, and then we're going to switch up the format a little bit. I'm going to cover some content on the macro side to prepare you for what's happening right now. And then I'm going to put you through what I would call some CIA state-sponsored propaganda to make you think the opposite is happening so that you're not prepared for what comes next. And just before I do that, I'm going to take a little bit of water right now. And what I'd like you to do is do me a favor. If you enjoy this content, I want as many people to get this content. You may not agree or like what I say, but I'm going to prepare you for what I believe to be true. And I've got a track record over the last 25 years of saying things that get people years ahead, whether it be Bitcoin at $3, whether it be the global financial crisis when I was working in investment banking and left in 2006 to share monetary reform, whether it be the Great Depression of the 2020s that I was preparing people for many, many years ago, whether it be when the Ukraine war started off and I said that this would lead to a shift in power and therefore the Trump administration would come in and then we would enter into a policy that would weaken the dollar and lead to a radically changing environment so they could blame the fall of the US empire on Trump. Whether it be any of those trends, please do subscribe, like, share, and help me get the algorithm so that more people see this content, and get yourself a free login on simondixon.com. And then we're going to move to part 2. I'd like you to do that right now. I'm just going to have a little bit, and then we're going to go through this week in macro, and I'm going to mix up, and we're going to go through a video so that I can retranslate it for you, just like I did the Scott percent, so that you don't fall for the propaganda. On 3, you do that. 1, 2, 3. Okay, whether you're watching this on Twitter, whether you're watching this on Rumble, whether you're watching this on YouTube, whether you're watching this on Apple, Spotify, if you got the podcast, make sure you download it. We're creating it in as many formats as possible and even creating blogs of it on simondixon.com. We do not want this information to not get to you because we haven't provided it in the format where you can get it. So we're now moving into part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 80, where we're sharing BlackRock versus the world, because people think that they are in a trade war between USA and China. And I'd like you to know that that is a distraction. And so what I want to do is I want to help you understand the real power structure of the world. I've always called it a proof of weapons network. The reason is because this debt-based Ponzi scheme created by a central bank in order to obfuscate the funding of war, in order to get countries deep into debt, started with the Bank of England in 1694, and then moved to the current iteration, which is the Federal Reserve in 1913. and then morphed into a new stateless structure led by BlackRock as the new CEO of the proof of weapons network. And so what you often see is that people have outdated narratives because with macro and geopolitics and power structures, there is always a morphing and a fluidity. When operations go right and wrong, capital gets redistributed and models change. I've always been sharing people, how this came from the elite families and the central banks were funding wars in order to take over resources and then using banks in order to get a monopoly on the creation of the dollar and the pound and the euro. And then wars led to organizations like the Bank for International Settlements to take mercantilism, where gold is transferred into a new power structure, and then the world order changes. And then you had the Bretton Woods system, which required World War II in order to set up. And then you had the default by America in 1971, where they stopped the convertibility of the dollar into gold. And now you entered into the full fiat currency proof of weapons network, where there was no check and control on the amount of war that could be created and the amount of debt. And so you entered into this ginormous twin deficit that America, by policy, deliberately went into because it was controlled by a larger force. So central banks were a mechanism of stealing wealth, wiping out the middle class, getting the government bigger and bigger and bigger, turning a capitalist country into an oligarchy, a socialist country, and eventually at its extreme, like in Europe, almost like communism through a central bank digital currency, which I think we're transitioning to in Europe by the end of this year and throughout 2026. But this central banking debt-based Ponzi scheme is a way of creating a macro game to change the rules where it doesn't really matter who's in charge. The famous Rothschild quotes were, give me control over money and I care not who writes the laws. That is the reality, because when you have a monopoly over the currency, you're able to control the game and you're able to buy the politicians. And then you can pretend that it is a democracy when you in fact have an oligarchy through a shadow covert network rather than an overt type of position as well. So anyway, central banks decentralized. So originally you had the Bank of England. And then when the power structure went over to the Federal Reserve, and there were a couple more central banks in between and many others, but I want to simplify it for now. The shareholders of the Federal Reserve were the large global banks. And the large global banks were headed up by the rich families, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Morgans. And we know that they merged into each other at different times as well. When JP Morgan passed away, he only had 20% of his wealth. 80% was distributed across Rothschild networks and very other European families. So while there is often a US front, there is also a European front as well. Now, over time, they used deregulation through Glass-Steagall Act, where you could create the digital dollar, the digital pound, the digital euro, and all the different currencies. And you could combine it with investment banking, where you could socialize all the losses and get a bailout through the retail bank. But then you could also create financial products that had no reserves or requirements on them at all. And you could create a shadow banking system via investment banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. I worked for an investment bank called KBC, the largest Dutch investment bank when I was working in corporate finance. But you're able to financialize and securitize everything, the political process, every single company. And those large banking families over time kept some of their positions through trusts and blind trusts, but they mainly sold them into the public markets as well to diversify into gold and hard assets. So they always fall back upon hard money because they know that the long-term wealth is hard money. And today we have physical hard money gold. Silver's not really hard money. It's more industrial. The supply is not known. The stock to flow is not good. And then you have Bitcoin, which was the hardest form of digital money through this proof of work network. And those are the two forms of hard money that exist today. Now, obviously, they use other types of assets like art and various other types of things to preserve wealth, whether it be wine or whiskey and various other stuff. But main thing is gold and now Bitcoin today. And so they could sell all their shares and move over to hard money. And then they could use these different stocks to borrow, rinse out all the money, hyper financialize, and create a derivative market that dwarfs the real economy. And so this is what you have. And you have like a multi-quadrillion market. And then what they do is they use as collateral loans to the US government. And therefore they can influence this process of what the rate to borrow is, who to borrow, which banks to send bust. And this is what you really saw during the global financial crisis in 2008. So the public markets were used. And what you can also do is you can buy back your stock by borrowing through schemes like quantitative easing. And then the executives that are just plants for the shareholders, they can essentially get stock option schemes, and they can get incredibly wealthy on these multi-hundred billion, $1 million salaries and various other things by just pushing up the price of the stock. And by having this quarterly disclosure, you end up in a system that can never change. And so companies have to meet their quarterly profits on the public market. And by having to meet them, they are driven into short-term behavior, which essentially means that they can never have a long-term strategy. And so by having to always, out defeat the derivatives and the bond vigilantes and those that can get access to capital through hedge funds, you always have to get these good quarterly results. And if you don't, capital moves and capital flows. And then you control the political process by having lobby groups, and where every 2 years you have to meet the interns, and then you have to get new votes and you campaign for more money. And then they can get political favors by getting their money. And then within 4 years, it changes if you don't serve their agenda. And then capital only flows to those that meet the corporate agendas. And underneath that, you have intelligence agencies, what they call the deep state. And so the networks that were set up, like the CIA, MI6, Five Eyes, and Mossad, these are just networks where 10% is for national security, but 90% is to create wars that can then go and fetch resources. You can fund groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, M23, M13. You can create violence in regions, and then you can get access to the rare earth minerals that you need, the gold that you need. It's basically neo-digital mercantilism when the British Empire transferred over to the American Empire, and then they digitized everything, securitized everything, financialized everything, until there was this new, more distributed network of power called the proof of weapons network. And by having these public companies, the old money could swap you're able to exit your position through stocks and end up with hard money at the end of it. The end game is that everyone wants hard money, because all of these different paper products, financial products, derivatives products, they're all subject to manipulation. When the hard money, the supply can never change, and scarcity is what drives value. And that's what's driving the Bitcoin proposition and what drove the gold proposition in the physical world before. Now, what became really interesting is through this deregulated environment and acts like Glass-Steagall, which basically put together retail banking with investment banking where you could create the products, they also combined it with the money management industry. So a large global bank like Barclays would have Barclays Capital, the investment bank, Barclays Commercial and Retail, the retail banks, where they get to create digital money every time they issue a loan, and then Barclays Wealth, where they would actually manage endowment funds, insurance funds, and then they had Barclays iShares, where they would create these products like ETFs. And ETFs were essentially where, rather than everyone having to decide what stocks to buy, you just buy an ETF. And then they buy all those stocks for you, and you get exposure to, say, the 500 largest stocks in America, or the largest stocks in China, or various different sectors. And this company called BlackRock was essentially chosen as the money manager to manage in the future trillions of dollars of assets. They did a couple of things. They created a technology really, really early where they could give money managers technology, governments technology, and central banks technology, where they could manage monetary policy, fiscal policy, and institutional investments and alternative products that would allow them to securitize land, wheat, resources, oil, carbon credits, every product you could possibly imagine through their investment bank. And then they would pull together all of the money through endowment funds, through insurance contributions, through pension contributions to get more and more money. And then they would invest more in this technology that would pull together all of this data of all the money managers in the world. And in fact, in 2008, during the global financial crisis, BlackRock ended up giving that technology to the Federal Reserve to use to determine which banks to go bust, which assets to sell. And so they wiped out some of the banks involved in the proof of weapons money laundering network via Vatican Bank, for example, Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, Jeffrey Epstein's network where he worked, which was a blackmail ring in order to bribe people into the network and have political control, and then handed over to like Jeffrey Epstein's bank, like Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, who would receive money from the Federal Reserve, and then they could reposition using this technology and early artificial intelligence that came from military innovation in order to control monetary flows. And during COVID, for example, BlackRock actually gave that technology to Treasury in order to manage the carving up of many different assets around the world so that it could take over the real estate market, the private equity market, the public markets, and it could put more and more consolidation of power until it ended up with trillions and trillions of dollars of assets. And during the global financial crisis, they wiped out the ETF department of Barclays. BlackRock acquired it, and it ended up having all the ETF power, all of the endowment fund money, all of the the pension money, the insurance money, the technology that is being utilized by Treasury for fiscal policy, and the Federal Reserve for monetary policy, and the Bank for International Settlements through the IMF and all of the network of central banks, so that it could be utilized as a ginormous pool of data with all of the money managers that are all relying upon data from this technology in order to move the flows of capital all around the world. And this became the foundation. Now, there were competitors like Vanguard and State Street, and they all invested in each other. And so they all essentially took the shares of all the banks, took all of the different, made them public, and then ended up acquiring more and more and deeper positions. And that gave them board seats on the institutions, as well as you handing over your voting rights, as well as having the technology. And BlackRock was the net winner. And I would say the CEO of the proof of weapons network. Now you have the ability to financialize through your investment banks, to create digital currency through your retail banks, to pool over capital through your money management arms and your fund management, and also direct the flow and influence what companies do through board positions and ETFs and voting rights in those shares. And that is the top of the chain. And then they invest in each other. It's somewhat of a more decentralized network, but through the technology, you can control the flow of capital and engineer games and wars that we'll be covering in the geopolitical section, so that you can take over economies. And it created essentially a state above the state. Some call it the deep state, but it controls intelligence. It controls the money printers. It controls the commercial banks. It controls the money management, and it controls the flow of capital through big data, big compute, artificial intelligence, and also can control which companies can take access to military technologies like Google, like X, like Mark Zuckerberg through Meta and Facebook. And you can utilize, like Tesla, can utilize all of these technologies that were innovated by military for killing people through these covert wars. And then you could give them to certain select companies, and then they could become and utilize and create products based upon government subsidies and carbon credits and manipulating money markets. And you can even short those stocks so that when things go wrong, you can move the flow of capital, and you can pretend that you have capitalism when you have full-blown crony communism via oligarchy and centralized power and centralized control in an covert network of control where people think that they're in charge and they've got a democracy. This is where we are right now. And when we go through this a little bit deeper, I'd like you to understand the propaganda that people put out there so that this is all for you to get ahead of the game, because the only way I'm able to get ahead of these games is because I don't listen to propaganda. I don't listen to what politicians say. I just look what they're doing with their money. I follow monetary flows, and I update people every week so that they can do the same as well. And so this is how you change the power structure. And I put it to you, the current power structure is not the Rothschild families, is not the Federal Reserve. These are just simply nodes in the proof of weapon network where those that control the capital control everything that's happening in the world right now, including the politicians. Now, people come to me and say, hey, I love Trump. I think Trump is patriotic and MAGA. I say it's not more powerful than BlackRock. BlackRock can create wars. It can assassinate. It can weaponize the CIA, the FBI. It can change the flow of capital. It can blackmail. It can assassinate. It can do whatever it wants through its covert networks. And it can do it all with plausible deniability, with no accountability and no Congress. And it can buy politicians through lobby groups and essentially change the structure of where military money goes, when the bank wins, where large loans go. And this is the power structure that makes the large decisions. And you think that Trump, that may have lawfare, debt, connections to Jeffrey Epstein from his real estate deals, assassination attempts, you think that he can come up against BlackRock? Nobody becomes a president unless they do what the proof of weapons network wants them to do. And that's why everything that's happening with tariff policies is as follows. And remember when I said this tariffs is not going to redistribute to Main Street, build the manufacturing base, and make America great again. This is the strategy of BlackRock that will have three impacts. And by BlackRock, I mean the whole network. But BlackRock is the CEO, so we'll call it BlackRock right now. And Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock. What the implementation of tariff policies are is that firstly, is it will wipe out middle businesses. It will have a redistribution of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street, because the large organizations that BlackRock controls will be able to get access to capital through the proof of weapons network to do M&A and acquire the distressed companies, so that the Magnificent Seven, for example, that all have their largest shareholders as Blackguard, State Street, Vanguard as well, can basically acquire and do deals with the Trump administration. The Trump administration negotiates for the BlackRock portfolio of companies, ports, land, deals, and all of the wealth is socialized across Main Street and privatized across Wall Street and the money managers. Now, what about the deals that are happening globally? Well, the deals that are happening globally are because the countries that are under the thumb of the International Monetary Fund is now deciding that the countries that have the sovereign wealth, and by sovereign wealth, I mean, if you want world reserve currency, you have a twin deficit, a trade deficit and fiscal deficit. By design, you can't have world reserve currency and balance your book, because your job is to export dollars, and dollars are debt, globally around the world. And so you use covert wars and terrorism and mercantilism in order to do that overtly and pretend you're fighting for democracy, when really what you're doing is the sovereign wealth is being built up by those countries that don't have a privatized central bank, a privatized debt-based currency through banks, and they don't have resources that are privatized for private interests. Because by privatizing the country's resources and the currency and the banking system, you create a force that is bigger than government, that controls government. That's what Europe has. That's what anyone that has IMF loans has. That is what America has. That is what Europe has, and what Britain has. And that's why, essentially, the governments no longer work for us. because they work for the power structure of the proof of weapons network. So if BlackRock says, don't look after pensions, don't fix streets, don't look after your hospitals and healthcare system, please send billions of dollars to Ukraine so that then we can install our politicians like Zelensky. We can bribe him off and the money goes back to General Dynamic, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, which we're essentially have board seats on, and we're able to manipulate the share price. And suddenly in the last quarter, 8% growth in the military companies. We can sacrifice Europe. We can do things like push a ESG narrative at the same time as blowing up through our CIA network, the Nord Stream pipeline, so that Germany, which now has the European Central Bank in charge, can destroy its manufacturing base, switch off the solution to its energy, which is nuclear power. That's the elephant in the room, by the way. Nuclear power is the most efficient, cheapest energy that can power all of this artificial intelligence. But they don't want you to know that. They want you focused on building windmills and various other things, which only countries with a cheap manufacturing base like China can dominate. So they dominate the renewable energy that gets the price of energy down to zero through its cheap manufacturing base. And Germany just essentially goes bankrupt. It can't use its nuclear weapon. It can't get cheap natural gas through Nord Stream pipeline from Russia. And now it has to get expensive gas from America, which destroys the economy, sends it into recession. And then at the same time, the ECB can wipe out all the wealth of the middle class and normal people by engineering the funding of narratives to say Putin is suddenly about Hitler and he's about to take over Europe. And so then they think they're flying democracy and they wonder why they're choosing between eating and heating. They're in a recession. They can't afford shit. There's civil unrest in their country. Things are getting deteriorated. Their rubbish isn't being collected, but they should cheer along, sending billions of dollars to Lockheed Martin and corrupt politicians because they think that they're fighting for democracy. And then in the meantime, you can carve up the rare earth minerals. You can get BlackRock to own half of Ukraine, and they can financialize and securitize, and you can create nodes like Kyostama, and Kyostama can go to the IMF and they can collateralize the country to financialize it so that BlackRock can end up with the assets, the IMF can issue the loan, and through these collateralized loans, they can engineer the markets in order to end up with the financialization of all the land, divide and conquer, and more power in order to control the network and engineer wars. Now, those countries that don't allow corporations to get bigger than them, don't allow for the privatization of their natural resources so that you have to tax people instead of the resources being used for the people, and that don't have a non-debt-based Ponzi scheme, they end up with all the surplus. And so Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Emiratis ended up with $5 trillion, while America ended up with nothing. But the socialization of the losses to the people and privatization of the gains, and through the BlackRock network, they redistribute capital globally and create these ginormous multinational institutions that are controlled with board seats by BlackRock ETFs, and they can control all of this monetary network. That is how the proof of weapons network, and that is how BlackRock sat. But BlackRock has to negotiate with real sovereign powers, i.e. China, that has a manufacturing base and doesn't have a debt-based Ponzi scheme. It has its debt issues because it pumped real estate, but that's a state banking system. And Saudi, which has the sovereign wealth through its resources. And now we get this negotiation, and I'll go through more of it. I covered it last week in the multipolar world order, where essentially BlackRock controls the politicians that are called democracies, and they're negotiating with the countries that are still sovereign, which have the surpluses. And then if you want to change the world order, rather than reforming money and reforming the Federal Reserve, ECB, Bank of England system, you do a PSYOP called tariffs, because you can't fix money with tax reform. And so Trump does tax reform, which essentially wipes out, will eventually wipe out Main Street, because they can't afford the import tax that they're about to pay, and the large corporations can access capital and acquire them, the export-dependent countries end up being acquired, essentially as many assets as possible because they're in debt to the IMF. And the sovereign countries align and go strategically closer, where those that are in debt choose, rather than go to America, which they've got massive tariffs, they go to China instead. And China set up this BRICS network that aligned with the Middle Eastern network called the GCC, and they use that in order to negotiate and take on BlackRock. And the banking network that funded the Trump administration is aligned with this multipolar world order. And so therefore, all you need to do is engineer games that reset the world order, which is the tariff policy and everything we're implementing right now. But you need the people to believe, just like in Europe and Britain, you needed the people to believe that their government is still a democracy and that Putin is Hitler and they should send all their money for the profits of BlackRock. Now America needs to do the same. So America, because BlackRock is the stateless, more powerful institution, they're saying, let's build up the rest of the world and let's take what we used to do through the central banking system to Africa, to the global south, and let's do it upon the host nation. Let's do it to Europe. Let's do it to Britain. Let's create civil unrest. Let's do it to America. And so you have this environment of never using the money to actually help Americans. And then you make them believe through a narrative called MAGA, Make America Great Again. And we're going to rebuild the manufacturing base, and we're going to redistribute wealth away from Wall Street over to Main Street. And then you do the opposite while it's happening. And that's exactly what is happening right in front of us right now. Now, at the same time, you need people to believe that the opposite is happening. And so while the Trump administration is going short on the dollar through stablecoins, long on Bitcoin, the central banks are buying gold, and BlackRock is repositioning capital globally and taking on wars in order to reposition new power structures around the world. Americans think that this is some kind of revolution called Liberation Day, when the reality is you're liberating the world from the dollar and you're moving to this multipolar world order. And so today there is no trade war. It doesn't exist. The trade war already happened. That was the Federal Reserve versus PBOC in a multi-decade strategy, and China ended up with all the assets and the manufacturing base, and the Federal Reserve gave all the profits to the banks and gave away and sold off all the assets of America, Europe, and Britain to those who had money. And now they're negotiating foreign direct investment, which is the takeover from the oligarchy and corporatocracy and technocracy of the country, and managing that transition so that these countries are in these different battles between China and BlackRock, and the Saudi Arabia and the GCC and BlackRock. And pretty much you could take those three power structures, BlackRock representing the complete asset stripping of the people of the West, with China that remains sovereign and Saudi Arabia that remains sovereign. And those are the three power structures that we have. There's a bit more to it, but I want to simplify down. Then what you need is you need to, through Operation Mockingbird, to have narratives that make it acceptable to the people. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get Azad to play a video. And I've done interviews with Daniela. I'm not saying anyone, most people don't know who they work for. You get sponsorship, you invite on guests. Some people look like they're influencers, but they're sponsored by someone. And then you don't know who is ahead of the sponsorship. So some people don't even know that they're a useful idiot for the military industrial complex and spreading propaganda. But I would like to play an interview that I think I'd like to retranslate, just like I did with the Scott Bessent interview, so that you can understand how this game works. Because they need you to believe that the opposite of what is happening is currently happening to make it acceptable to you. So Azad, let's play the interview of what I consider to be, it's not an attack on the character, but CIA proof of weapons network sponsored propaganda to make what is happening right now acceptable to the American people, while there is a massive redistribution of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street, and they asset strip all of your assets, just like they did to the Brits in the UK and the Europeans in Europe. So Azad, let's play the interview.
The Chinese economy is facing desperate times. This is the warning of my guest today, Gatestone Institute Senior Fellow Gordon Chang, and author of Plan Red, China's Plan to Destroy America. Gordon, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Daniela.
Look, this is developing minute by minute here. You say and warn, look, China is tough, but Trump is tougher. How does this play out for you?
This is going to be a long struggle, and part of it is because I think Xi Jinping has boxed himself in. He has configured the Chinese political system so that only the most hostile answers are considered to be acceptable. And for about a half decade, he has told the Chinese people that China has already surpassed the United States, which means that if he gives in to Trump, or even if he just reacts to pressure to begin negotiations, that undermines everything that he's told the Chinese. And so I think that makes it very difficult for him to come to terms. And we've seen this in this controversy over the last couple of days, where you have President Trump saying, we've been talking to the Chinese about trade, and the Chinese saying, no, there are no trade discussions at all. And I think that's a real indication that the Chinese really find themselves in a hard position. Now, of course, we don't know outside. People on the outside, like me, don't know 100% who's telling the truth.
Right.
But we do know one thing, and that is that the United States and China talk to each other all the time. I mean, forget about the trade war. Forget about the tariff war. We talk to each other all the time. So, for the Chinese to say that there have been no discussions about trade, especially with all of the tariffs, that's not very credible.
This begs the question.
Okay, so look, let me give some commentary on that. So this is laying the framework for you believing that America is winning when the trade war has already been won. This is the execution of the fact that America already lost the trade war, but it didn't lose. The American people lost the trade war because they sold the entire economy off to BlackRock and the proof of weapons network. And so while it is asset stripping, it needed to change the narrative away from Biden that's taking us to World War III to Trump that's going to make America great again and implement tariffs for the American people. And they need you to believe that that China is about to collapse. And they built those narratives because they said, because China has a state banking system, they want you to believe that it's the same as the Federal Reserve System. So when they have overinvestment in real estate and large amounts of debt for the people, they're basically, making you think that this is the same as the Federal Reserve System. But it's not, because it's the complete opposite. So China has the reserves. It's a surplus country with trade surplus and vast reserves and vast gold reserves. And so they want you to believe that they're about to crash and they're about to die because they've got the same leverage that America has, which has a privatized banking system. And so, they need that type of propaganda. They also need you to believe that the people of China are like the American people, where they're constantly fighting over the left and the right. Well, no, they don't engage much in politics. Look, I'm not telling you what I think is a good system. I'm telling you what is the system that we have today. I'm not engaging in what I want the system to be. I'm telling you what the system is so that you can understand it, because they're just point blank lying to you with this type of propaganda. And so what China has done is they did the opposite of the IMF model. They went around to countries and said, we're not going to regime change you. We're not going to violently overthrow you. We're going to invest in your infrastructure like we invested in our people, where generally, while the people may not like our authoritarian style, but in general, they're significantly wealthier. And we've switched from communism to regional capitalism, but we keep our resources for our people rather than taxing the people at a very high rate. And so they end up with fast trains. They end up with investment in education. They end up with infrastructure. They end up with capital controls. Now, you may not like capital controls, but it meant China didn't sell its economy to America. So now it's not controlled by foreign, just like now, $27 trillion of assets are owned by China and the Saudis, and Trump's going to Saudi Arabia saying, please invest 1.4 trillion into our artificial intelligence, assets, stripping the assets and handing it over to foreign control. And so they did the opposite of that. They said, we'll invest, but we won't interfere in your country. And they built this network of people that were able to get access to their technology. And they were allowed to govern their country in that way without being overthrown or told that they need to have a central bank installed that takes away all of the wealth from their people through a debt-based Ponzi scheme. So it built all of these allegiances across Africa, across the global south, across the BRICS network. And once the sanctions were weaponized, it drew everyone closer, where the BRICS countries and the GCC, the Gulf countries, aligned in order to merge those BRICS. So you had UAE, Saudi Arabia kind of joined, but instead of going to the G7 meeting, went to the BRICS meeting, which is a signal that he's saying we're slowly managing this relationship between America and BRICS. And now we're very, very influential. And now we're aligned with BlackRock. So BlackRock, which wants to invest and make more money working with us, can change the world order. And then all of the people, all of the politicians, they get to invest in this new world order, make a load of money while they're exerting this. And they just need you to believe that this relationship doesn't exist, that in fact, there's not about to be a revolution in the country because people are overthrowing their government because they hate them so much. I'm not saying some don't, but the ones that do, they ended up leaving the country. And so you get this warped view from the people that didn't like it and left the country that decided to stay within America, which is different to the ones that stayed. And so that shapes the narrative. It's called a fifth column. And then you can shape the narrative whenever you want to exert influence over the country where the immigrants came from. And so, look, that's the reality. China's already won this trade war and tariff is the execution, but they need you to believe that America's about to win, a deal's about to be announced, and the deal will take 3 years to negotiate anyway. And all the details have already been figured out. It's just this is the implementation of the multipolar world order based upon some of the physical wars that were fought around the world that led to, this situation where America had to strategically retreat because all of the assets were sold off and the credit card was maxed out. And now they need to roll over $10 trillion and their partners are no longer lending. So Japan's saying, if you don't do a deal with us, then we'll sell. These are basically ASEAN and Asia are realigning around the new power structure of the world and accumulating assets. And BlackRock is essentially being negotiated by the Trump administration. So none of the benefit is for the American people. It's all for the corporations that are global in nature, get better deals, and will get to acquire Main Street. It's just like COVID. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Only the large can survive. And so, yeah, he wants you to believe that that is what is happening in China. Again, I'm not dealing in what I want the system to be. I'm dealing in what the system is. And you need to either step into common sense corner or believe the Operation Mockingbird CIA propaganda that feeds you, and then you won't protect yourself because you think that they're gonna actually make America great again and look after you. Or the meanwhile, BlackRock is planning how to destroy the economy and utilize any useful assets like it's doing in Europe and turn America into a technocratic AI robotics artificial intelligence center powered by stable coins, where only money is used in order to serve the agenda of BlackRock's portfolio and its proof of weapons network. And if you protest too much, they've already beta tested all the technology in the Middle East, and all of that Middle East violence is going towards Europe. So Europe is got another $1 trillion it needs to give to BlackRock's portfolio companies. And then at the same time, you agitate a war in India, and we'll go through that more in the geopolitical section. So anyway, all of this to say is that this was all about believing that the situation in America is the situation in China. Let's go to the next question.
Where you have President Trump saying, we've been talking to the Chinese about trade, and the Chinese saying, no, there are no trade discussions at all. And I think that's a real indication that the Chinese really find themselves in a hard position. Now, of course, we don't know outside, people on the outside like me don't know 100% who's telling the truth.
Right.
But we do know one thing, and that is that the United States and China talk to each other all the time. I mean, forget about the trade war. Forget about the tariff war. We talk to each other all the time. So, you know, for the Chinese to say that there have been no discussions about trade, especially with all of the tariffs, that's not very credible.
This begs the question, Gordon, who needs who more? China? Does China need the U.S. or does the U.S. need China?
Oh, that one's clear. China needs the U.S. more. First of all, we are the larger economy. China's economy is less than 2/3 the size of ours. More important, we're the trade deficit country. Last year, China's merchandise trade surplus against the U.S. was $295.4 billion. That was up 5.8% from 2023. But also, remember, China is a trade-dependent economy, export-dependent. Because Xi Jinping has turned his back on consumption as the fundamental basis of the Chinese economy, which means that the only way for him to rescue a desperate situation is to export more. And one other thing, China's right now probably contracting. It's not growing at the 5.4% pace that they reported for Q1. And we see this from, for instance, price data for February and March, where the CPI was down for 2 consecutive months. And the producer price index, which measures factory gate prices, that was down in March for the 30th straight month. That says deflation. And I think that really says, look, China, maybe it's growing, but it's probably contracting. So you have all of these factors at the same time. And that means President Trump, at least from the objective factors, he holds almost all the high cards.
What about reports?
Okay, absolutely everything he just said is the opposite of what's the truth. And so this is such state-sponsored propaganda. All right, so let's look at this. A global recession will impact everybody. But the country that is over-leveraged is the one that can't survive the recession. Unless you print more money, which brings you into a QE hyperinflationary cycle. Not hyperinflationary, let's call it inflationary cycle, and redistributes wealth. And at the moment, America, almost all of its consumption is the top 10% of wealthy people in America. And so the consumption is debt. And if you go into a global recession, you end up making the debt situation worse, while long-term rates are going higher, while America has to refinance $10 trillion of debt. So if you are leveraged, you can't survive a global recession without a radical change in the world order. Now, will that impact China? Absolutely. A global recession will impact everybody. So let's have a look at China. China exports 10 to 15% of its goods to America, and America needs the credit card and the rolling over of the debt in order to continue to do that. So that money is gone anyway, and particularly if you set a tariff policy that resets the world order. That then drives all the countries closer to China, and now those countries are now consuming from China rather than America. So rather than buying the iPhone, you're buying the iPhone from China, or you're buying Huawei or whatever, different technology you're buying from China in order to not pay the tariff. So now you have replaced the consumption of America's credit card by drawing the relationships closer to China. Now, China has 1.4 billion people, approximately the second largest population now. And so those 1.4 billion people were built upon savings. Now, yes, they got over leveraged because they bought real estate in the state banking model, but this is a nation of savers that can consume. And because they have a state banking system, the leverage is internal within its own country. It's not foreign controlled, like America debt is foreign controlled. So Japan and China can say, I'll sell all the treasuries, I won't buy it. And then they've got to create an elaborate scheme in order to find lower quality buyers of their treasuries by issuing stable coins and backing it by those treasuries and then using it to buy Bitcoin and various other things. Okay. So everything that he just said is that the country, obviously global recession affects everyone. Growth will go down, no doubt. GDP will go down. Everyone's impacted. But essentially, the consumption within China, which is 1.4 billion people, can take a chunk of the economy. The Belt and Road Initiative that is invested in the global south, and while the GCC, the Gulf countries, are demonetizing the IMF, when the IMF, USAID, NATO shrink away from those regions, they're allowed to grow again. They can use their own resources, and then they can build an economy that actually is not oppressed by the terrorism of the dollar and the pound and the euro. And so they get to do what those covert wars, because you're demonetizing the petrodollar, you're demonetizing the euro dollar, and you're creating asset stripping within these economies where only the rich are able to consume. And so the consumption can totally be made up. But even if it can't, it's got the reserves, it's got the non-leverage, it's got the gold reserves. And even though they'll report to you, yeah, China's only got 2,500 tons of gold. Come on, nobody believes that. The investigations that I've seen into the different shell companies at which it holds it through the state banking system is 22.5 tons of gold. America had to end the gold window because it only ended up with 8.5 tons of gold. And if you want to cause a real weakening of the dollar, audit Fort Knox. And if it's not there, you can strategically weaken the dollar, reset the world order, and you have all of these tools to manage that transition over time. And so all this to say, there is problems with demographics in China. There is over leveraging of the real estate market. And there is 10% or 15% of its exports that rely upon American consumption that China can totally weather the storm and America can't. And so either you shrink the economy into a regional power, do a monetary reform, asset strip it like they did with Europe, or you roll over the QE scheme and you take it into an inflationary cycle and wealth redistribution. That's why I said this week, and I said last week, the Fed won't lower rates and the Fed won't do QE. The reason that I know that is because I believe that they're going through this transitionary phase rather than doing business as usual. Okay, so once you understand that, you recognize that the state propaganda needs you to believe that America has all the cards. China has all the cards. And that's the reality. Give me another argument in the comments. I've debated people on Spaces, and I'll go through the policy and tell you based on my 25 years experience in economics, working in investment banking, investing, being involved in investing in over 100 all of that experience, bankruptcies, all the stuff I've been through. I can show you what I believe to be, and you can give me the counter argument. So I'll see you on Spaces if you want to debate it, and I'll see you in the comments below if you'd like to tell me why that's not the case. Azad, let's go to the next question.
$95.4 billion. That was up 5.8% from 2023. But also, remember, China is a trade-dependent economy, export-dependent, because Xi Jinping has turned his back on consumption as the fundamental basis of the Chinese economy, which means that the only way for him to rescue a desperate situation is to export more. And one other thing, China's right now probably contracting. It's not growing at the 5.4% pace that they reported for Q1. And we see this from, for instance, price data for February and March, where the CPI was down for 2 consecutive months, and the producer price index, which measures factory gate prices, that was down in March for the 30th straight month. That says deflation, and I think that really says, look, China, maybe it's growing, but it's probably contracting. So you have all of these factors at the same time. And that means President Trump, at least from the objective factors, he holds almost all the high cards.
What about reports, Gordon, that China has been preparing for this moment? They've been looking for partners outside of the U.S. There was the whole Reset Summit with other Asian nations of them uniting and forming some sort of alliance to defeat the U.S.?
Yeah, Xi Jinping went to Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia recently. Now, Cambodia is a Chinese vassal, so I'm sure that Xi Jinping got everything he wanted out of Cambodia. But Malaysia and Vietnam are much more dependent on the U.S. So, for instance, Vietnam, which is the most important of those 3 countries, they run a trade deficit with China. They have a big trade surplus with us. And just after Xi Jinping left, a senior Vietnamese official said that the relationships between Hanoi and Washington were of core importance to the Vietnamese. So, I mean, that was basically Vietnam saying to Xi Jinping, yeah, it was nice you were here, glad you stopped by, but no, we're not going to let you decimate our economy. Daniela, the one thing here is that because of Trump's tariffs, he has shut a lot of Chinese products out of the United States. That means Xi Jinping's got to sell them somewhere. Countries are not going to allow the Chinese to decimate their economies with the goods they would have otherwise sold the U.S. And in fact, India just slapped the 12% tariff on steel to prevent the Chinese from flooding the Indian market with Chinese steel that otherwise would have been sold to America.
Well, that's why you...
Okay, pause there, Azad. Let's go to the next section. Right. Okay, so let's deconstruct it. So China has been preparing for this for a long time because they were involved in a cold trade war, a proxy war. And this has been building and brewing for a long time. BlackRock, who is in charge of America, Europe, and has financialized and securitized, while the other countries have built their sovereign wealth, have already been preparing for all of this. This is why BRICS was originally created, where they aligned their economies. Because Russia, Iran, and China had to align, during the CIA operation to destroy Europe through the Ukraine war to end up with all the resources and carve up the land for BlackRock, there are countries all around the world. Vietnam remembers that 50 years ago, they were being obliterated in the Vietnamese War, and America lost it. And the goal of the war is always a forever war. I've been Vietnam. I remember those war museums. I defy anyone to go to those war museums and see the people that had chemical weapons blown up upon them that are still in the streets, decapitated and all sorts of, sorry, not decapitated, but, their legs chopped off, all sorts of stuff. You go to Vietnam. If anyone's been there, I've been there. I've traveled the world. Bitcoin took me around the world to all of these different countries. I got to experience, what the impact of these wars actually are. And the reality is that the ASEAN countries had a conference and they all said that the order is being reset. They recognize that this is Liberation Day from the dollar after abuse by the International Monetary Fund. And now this is the time to actually become a sovereign nation by forming new partnerships. Now, India has a debt-based Ponzi scheme monetary system. And what was India? India was a propped up economy by BlackRock. So what did India do? Well, firstly, it was fueling the military industrial complex. It became the third largest purchaser of weapons. And during the Russian sanctions, India was allowed to purchase Russian gas and sell it on to Europe. And so they built a growth and a temporary growth in the economy based upon debt and loans from BlackRock and the proof of weapons network. And so they implemented the model of propagandizing its people, creating civil unrest, creating racial and religious tensions, and radicalizing its people so that they could get it ready and prepped and justified for war, so that it could take all of the previous damage of the British Empire when they left Kashmir, Pakistan, and India in ruins, and they could take all of that racial and religious tensions, caste system, all sorts of stuff, and they could control narrative in order to ratchet up and create false flag operations so that they could financialize and securitize the whole Indian economy. And so by giving it this fake subsidy, BlackRock is now able to invest more through the banking system, is able to control more of the Indian economy, is able to sell $80 billion of weapons a year to India. And China has already built the Belt and Road Initiative with Pakistan. So Pakistan essentially becomes strategically weakened and a vassal state for China, drawing Pakistan and those routes closer to China, more on the BRICS narrative, while BRICS is invested and aligned with this new multipolar world order, but they try and get as much control as they can by turning India into a debt-based Ponzi scheme, just like they did in America and Europe and Britain. So they're now trying to find their host nations to destroy the wealth of the people and hand it over to large industries and do essentially the wealth transfer model, but within India. So the ASEAN conference, they all came closer. They created alternative payment system outside of the dollar. The BRICS were all strategically aligned. And because of the proxy war in Israel by America in order to create division within the Middle East, the GCC had all of the economic power by partnering and normalizing with Israel and America. And they were now able to exert that and get to where we are today, that we'll cover in the geopolitical section, but essentially have peace in the Middle East, a new region of normalization, and align with the GCC blocks, the ASEAN blocks, and the BRICS blocks have all aligned to strategically allow for this transition to finally being liberated from the dollar. And he wants you to believe that all of those relationships are going to go to America, while they're implementing a tariff war to deliberately just negotiate deals for BlackRock and BlackRock's portfolio company. And so Trump is just a salesman for BlackRock's portfolio company at this stage. Nothing's going to help Americans. Everything's going to help his backers. And that's because of the structure that I covered at the beginning of this for the proof of weapons network, where no government, no president works for the people. They just simply work for the corporate interest that controls the system. And so that's India. And that's how we're going to get the opposite of what he said. Next question.
They run a trade deficit with China. They have a big trade surplus with us. And just after Xi Jinping left, a senior Vietnamese official said that the relationships between Hanoi and Washington were of core importance to the Vietnamese. So, I mean, that was basically Vietnam saying to Xi Jinping, yeah, it was nice you were here, glad you stopped by, but no, we're not going to let you decimate our economy. Daniela, the one thing here is that because of Trump's tariffs, he has shut a lot of Chinese products out of the United States. That means Xi Jinping's got to sell them somewhere. Countries are not going to allow the Chinese to decimate their economies with the goods they would have otherwise sold the U.S. And in fact, India just slapped the 12% tariff on steel to prevent the Chinese from flooding the Indian market with Chinese steel that otherwise would have been sold to America.
Well, that's why you raised a really good point. And, we saw Scott Bessett's points that we want to help them. We want to get them on the right side of the page. But then I was speaking to, investor Kevin O'Leary, who would say, but look what they did when we invited them into the World Trade Organization. Then they never abided by the rules. So why do we think that they're going to be accommodative or listen now?
Well, Scott Bessent was trying to talk to the markets, trying to appease them. But what he said was, 100% right. Yes, of course, China needs to rebalance. But what it ignores is Xi Jinping does not believe in consumption as the basis of the Chinese economy. Matter of fact, last couple of years, consumption's contribution to gross domestic product has declined. It's now about 38, 39%, like one of the lowest in the world. Xi Jinping wants a wartime economy. He doesn't believe in empowering Chinese citizens. And also, he does not want to offend core Communist Party constituencies, especially the state banks. So Scott Bessent can say those things, and maybe Americans will say, oh, yeah, that sounds right. But we've been saying that to the Chinese for a couple decades now. I mean, so, I look at that and just shake my head and say, what Scott Bessent should have said was, we've said all these things for 2 decades. Exactly. The Chinese are absolutely determined not to listen to us, so we're going to impose costs. Now, that would have tanked the markets, but at least he would have been telling the truth.
Very good point.
Okay, so pause there. Right. So we did the Scott Bessent interview in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 77. You're welcome to go through that. I won't go through that again. But this is the gaslighting of the lies. This is, they're making it out like America got ripped off by the Chinese. Here's what happened. America ripped off its own people. America set up a debt-based Ponzi scheme through the Federal Reserve that handed over control of the profits from creating money to the private banking sector. The private banking sector that is not America first decided that it would not use its money to lend to people to rebuild and make America great. It would maximize profits and use a debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to wipe out the middle class and use its power structure to work with the consolidation of power, the control of the government, and the furthering of the deep state and the privatization of all the assets of America. Now, in order to have the world reserve currency so that it could export its dollars around the world, so that it could have an exorbitant privilege that it would allow America and the Federal Reserve to steal all the wealth from the middle class people, it created this debt-based Ponzi scheme, which required it to roll over debt with more debt until they could no longer do that because they couldn't sell bonds. And they carry on doing that until there is massive wealth concentration in the hands of the few that control the political process, and the government is so big that the proof of weapons network ends up with the vast majority of wealth under management, so it can create a deep state government where the government works for their interest and the CIA works for their interest, which is how it was set up all along. And then what they did is they said, in order to have the world reserve currency, Triffin's dilemma says you have to have more and more debt. And so they exported debt around the world through covert wars, making enemies all around the world to steal resources, make enemies all over anyone that was under the boot of the dollar, force them into IMF debt slavery. So people had to destroy their currencies to pay off their dollar debt in a dollar milkshake theory, where instead of investing in their own countries, they had to hold their dollars and lend it to the US government. And then the US government would have the largest liquid bond market in the world, would then fund more wars that would then siphon off more wealth from the Americans, the Europeans, and the Brits into the hands of the privatized corporations that would then hedge and invest and destroy their countries. And so the money, rather than being investing in their own countries, they remain third world because they will have currency wars exerted upon them if they ever do anything against the IMF debt and the central bank in Ponzi. Now that ends up with eventually severe wealth inequality in its own country. And you end up with extreme left and right polarization. And when you don't invest in your people or your education, you end up with people that are radicalized and have very deliberately not been invested in the education. And so therefore you start importing labor from other countries. So Chinese people decided to get an education in America. And you started to end up where the demographic issue, because people are no longer having children, because They, essentially can't afford to live anymore. You have to make it up through immigration, and then you can weaponize that in order to create civil unrest and narratives of invasions and open border policies, all while the other countries that have built a manufacturing base, invested in their people's education, invested in their country's infrastructure, has people that may not be happy with the government, but people feel that their wealth has grown because they had regional capitalism that had no intellectual property, no copyright, no trademarks. So you have the freest form of capitalism at the bottom level, but you're not allowed to become bigger than government, so that you can reinvest that money into the country. I'm not saying which model is best, but here's the reality. You had the same model as China, but they privatized the gains and socialized the losses. In China, they had the same model, but it was more overt. You slap a communist label on it. You say, we're the capitalists. You indoctrinate people into believing that this is real communism and real capitalism. And then they are essentially taking their gains and investing in their own people and building up countries and doing a reverse IMF effect. Look, that is the reality of the situation. So the exact opposite of what he's saying is the model. And this was by design, because the Federal Reserve is more important than the government. And this ended up with an alternative power structure where BlackRock would manage all the assets, accumulate all the assets, take over the networks, become the large power broker, and would invest globally where they can change the game at any point. And what did China do with their money? They purchased America, they purchased Europe, and they purchased Britain, as did the Middle Eastern countries. And so now they own the assets, they're the lender, and they hold the assets. And so they don't want to destroy America. They don't want to destroy their investments. They want to continue along the lines of this partnership. But America had a debt-based Ponzi scheme that was the wealth confiscation in direct violation of the Constitution. And everything they sold you about capitalism and democracy was a lie. So once it hits extreme right polarism, they need you to believe it was the commies' fault, the Chinese fault, and everyone around the world is ripping off America. And everybody's ripping off America. And they need you to believe that because they're facing the consequences of the policy and the lie that they sold you. And they want you to believe that you need to be patriotic to America, so you end up holding those assets. So you end up holding those assets, and you end up the bag holder while all of the sovereign wealth is being built. And they need you to believe this while they manage the transition, because BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network controls every aspect of your political process and all of your assets. And they need you to believe that the government works for you. The Europeans know that nobody in government works for them. The Brits know that. They know that they're being stolen from. But right now, they want you to believe that Trump works for you and he's more in power. He's more important than his power structure. Nobody is. And you know what? The sooner you can recognize it, the sooner you can reposition yourself, reposition your wealth, decide where you want to live, decide what's right for you and your family, and do what they're doing. Investing in Bitcoin, shorting the dollar, buying gold, and having BlackRock reposition their wealth into emerging markets that finally are going to be able to grow. Why? Because BlackRock figured out there's a more profitable money working with the global South rather than an asset stripping the West at the same time. Let's go to the last bit.
Hearing from you, though, overall, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the U.S. will come out on top. Trump will win here in his negotiations?
I think Trump will win. China has one card to play, and that is it's trying to pressure Wall Street, Main Street, C-suites, farmers to put pressure on Trump to cave. Most presidents, they probably would cave. Most presidents, we know, wouldn't start this in the first place. Trump's pretty determined. Trump believes that this is the contest, I think, for a very long time. I believe it's a contest for the century, but Trump may not see it in those terms. But Trump believes in tariffs. We know that because during the campaign, he kept on talking about tariffs. He talked about William McKinley, for God's sakes. So clearly he believes this. This is in his heart. And if he has a core belief, tariffs is it.
Gordon, are you at all concerned that this escalates more than a financial war, that it becomes some sort of a military war?
Yep. And the reason is that, you look at the objective factors, basically China doesn't have a way out of this. And Xi Jinping could very well decide that his only way out is actually to cause trouble someplace. Now, I don't think that Xi Jinping would start a war to rally the Chinese people, because we know the Chinese people do not want war. But I think Xi Jinping might think a war would be extremely useful because it would prevent senior Communist Party figures from challenging him. We know that Xi Jinping's hero is Mao Zedong. We know Mao employed this tactic in 1966 when he started the Cultural Revolution. Mao didn't have the ability to start a war, but he did have the ability to start a struggle with other Communist Party figures, and so as to preserve his position in the regime. I think that this is Xi Jinping looking what his hero did, and I think he's going to probably do the same thing. So yes, I'm very worried about that.
With Vietnam?
Okay, let's end it there. Right. Every accusation is a confession. This is pure gaslighting when you understand the truth. Now, what they are doing is they are weaponizing the indoctrination that you have been, for your whole life as an American, as a European, as a Brit, been brought into fear. And that fear is that they need you to believe that the communists are about to take over, while the military-industrial complex steals all your wealth by agitating all the wars around the world. If you look at the track record of the Bank of England that was later taken over by the Federal Reserve, essentially the same system, and if you look through 1694, the first war between the French and the Brits that were funded, all the way through, and I've covered it in Bitcoin Hard Talk, the reality of history, what World War I was actually, and what World War II was actually, and what the Cold War was actually, and what the fake war on terror was actually, and what the wars are being fought right now are actually, is that they were all manufactured wars for the profits of the military-industrial complex that was essentially the model of mercantilism that has led to the fall of the US empire. And rather than going to World War III, because America would have lost World War III, it created a couple of games. One game is its proxy Israel had a time frame in order to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from October the 7th, and I'll go through that in the geopolitical section. The second game was to agitate a war with Russia by doing regime changes and expanding NATO in order to take Europe down and find out whether Russia would capitulate to the American military-industrial complex through proxy for the profits of the military-industrial complex, so it could carve up everything to BlackRock. And BlackRock initiated those wars, and BlackRock was represented by the military-industrial complex and Biden in order to agitate to World War III, and it didn't go to plan. And so therefore Trump was told, instead of going to World War III, we'll shrink America into a regional power. You can implement the tariffs that you've been talking for years, and we'll split the world up into a multipolar world order, and you can invest in the GCC. You can get a loan from ICBC, the largest bank in China, and you can change America into a technocracy through stable coins, and you can short the dollar and go long Bitcoin and get as much Bitcoin as you can for you as you manage this transition. And that is exactly what has been implemented. And you need to strategically weaken all of the power that the dollar has in order to use global war to prop up. And now let's look at China and its track record of war. China does not want to reunify with Taiwan. Anytime you hear a narrative, it is CIA sponsored. It is to create a narrative to justify war. So if you hear about the Islamist invasion and the Khalifa and Sharia law being implemented all around the world and they want to take over your country, that is a manufactured narrative. If you hear the commies want to take over the world and communism is the CCP and all of that stuff, that is a manufactured narrative. If you hear that Xi Jinping wants to take over Taiwan because it's got semiconductor chips, the reality is that Taiwan is engaging in trade with China and trade with America. It has a one China policy, but America has been agitating those wars through the genocide and the disaster it created in the Philippines. And the World War II, when it wouldn't even join the war for the Jewish people to prevent the Holocaust, it had to wait until implementing an oil embargo. And then Japan retaliated by taking over a colonized land called Hawaii that the America was ethnically cleansing, and then bombed it. And Pearl Harbor agitated America into taking the Nazis' weapon through Operation Paperclip that created the CIA and MI6 with the Nazis, with the Jewish mob, and with the Italian mafia in order to then create and blow up the atomic bomb on 200,000 Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then we entered into the strategic escalation of other people having nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race. And America and the dollar and the deep state that was set up was the one that profited from that whole network as they created a criminal network via Vatican Bank. And then they use these wars in order to create institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlement, in order to profit from all of that war. And finally, enough economic power was built up because America decided to steal all the wealth from their people and hand it over to the global network of banks that then set up an alternative stateless power structure that is asset stripping the last remaining wealth from the host nations while it reinvests into a new multipolar world order. All because China had a plan. And that plan was to normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia, to allow for a two-state solution so that after this operation, you could end up into a region of peace in the Middle East where America strategically retreats by aligning with the GCC and the BRICS and ASEAN that can finally free itself from the dollar and change into a multipolar structure that benefits those that own gold, that benefits those that own Bitcoin, and recognize that if you want to sabotage all of that operation, then what you would do is China would reunify with Taiwan. Taiwan would then blow up all of the factories that have the Silicon Shield defense mechanism that would then send the world into a global recession that would blow up all of the assets, all of their investments in America. It would send China into a spiral because now we've got no artificial intelligence, no electricity industry, no Magnificent Seven, no technology, no Alibaba, because all of them rely upon the smooth semiconductor chips. It would create $2.2 trillion of economic destruction, and it would undo everything that it had achieved. And so if America, under the neocon model, under Biden, of the military industrial complex, it would agitate that war. But China will never fall for that because it knows, do the maths. Reunifying with Taiwan is just an absolute boogie monster lie, because it would destroy and be no good for anybody, because China doesn't want to build its economy based upon war. It now has aligned, and we have a new model and a new economy that for the first time can decolonize the global south, decolonize Africa, decolonize the institutions that were originally colonized by the Brits and then colonized by America. And if it wants to screw all that up, it would go to war. So they are pushing absolute ridiculous narratives because that's the exact model that propped up the dollar. And so either they're pushing out states propaganda to make you believe that China's going to war. Why? Because just like Keir Starmer, who is, rather than looking after the British people, he is entering into a 100-year agreement with the corrupt politician Zelensky so that Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and Raytheon And BlackRock can take all of the last money from the Europeans at the expense of the European people, and the last money from the Brits at the expense of the British people, as they want the last money from the Americans at the expense of the American people, by sending all that money, because they need profits to go away from the Middle East, and they need those contracts to go to Europe. So they need Hitler, they need Putin to be the next Hitler, and they need Xi Jinping to be the next Hitler. And you need to have a commie attack and a manufactured narrative. And any narrative that you get around that, look what happened during 9/11. 9/11 was a narrative just to radicalize the profits that they were going to steal from you, as they created $7.5 trillion of war in the Middle East, that from the start of the Bank of England to today killed 300 million people for the profits of BlackRock in the end, who consolidated that wealth and consolidated that power. And now they need you to believe that the American government works for the American people, and the European government works for the European people, and the British government works for the British people. The proof of weapons network won this model a long time ago. And the real battle has always been us versus them. And they need to divide and conquer to make sure that we don't recognize that we have decentralized power. We have Bitcoin that allows us to exit and boycott the system. We can de-weaponize their system by not borrowing their debt in the debt-based Ponzi scheme. We can stop investing and using their systems and instead purchase local. And we can build decentralized systems of decentralized artificial intelligence, decentralized money, and Bitcoin already set the model. We already defeated the Federal Reserve because BlackRock had to join us when they laughed at us when we first started with Bitcoin. And so now let's look at section 3, where we're going to go through this week in geopolitics and understand some of the games so that you can understand how BlackRock does not give a shit about you, because through its proof of weapons network, it is willing to engage in ethnic cleansing, genocide, war, rape, massacre, pillaging, and destruction. And we get to, for the first time in my lifetime, generationally, finally end up with a multipolar world where the boot of the US dollar gets to liberate the world if we can actually do the promise of capitalism, which is competition based upon hard money. And so let's have a look at the geopolitical section. Look, if you enjoyed this, you can either say, I work for the China Communist Party and I'm doing propaganda, or you can just simply follow the money, step into common sense corner and recognize I'm not telling you how I want the world to be. I'm telling you how the world is. And if you don't prepare for it, your politicians are going to wreck you, and you're going to be slaughtered to BlackRock because they work for them and they don't give a shit for you. And you can look what they're doing to countries, and you don't think that they're willing to do that to your country. Have a look what they did in Britain. Have a look what they did in Europe, and have a look at all those homeless people that went and fought those wars and are mentally ill, addicted to drugs in a network that the CIA created. Those drugs are not coming from China. They're coming from the CIA, because that's what the CIA was created for in the first place. And they may get resources by co-opting and raping and pillaging Afghanistan and funding groups in order to make you think that the boogie monster terrorists are trying to take away your freedom, when really these are groups that were trained by the CEO, by the CIA, for the profits of the military-industrial complex, to prop up black ops and drug trafficking so that they could get their country addicted to drugs and create an opium war in their own country, just like they did to China. Just like we did to China, that led to the creation of HSBC, that was the original money laundering for all the drug trafficking, so that we could famine 50 million Bengalis and steal the wealth of the gold and the silver from China and America that all ended up in Fort Knox, so that we could weaponize this network to steal resources. And now finally we get to change that order, and that's why I like it. So let's move into part 3. And in part 3, I'm going to take a quick water break, And I'd like you to like, share. I'd like to share this information. Put a comment below. Let me know what you think about this and help me get over to 100,000 subscribers. And if you would like content to prepare for this for free, head over to simondixon.com and create a free access and membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. I'm going to be creating free video series where I break down exactly how to prepare for this and what types of things you can do. I'm going to be releasing that in early 2026 as well. But we'll make sure you've got all the Great Depression of the video, Great Depression of the 2020s video series, the digital copy of my previous books, and a backup in case they take us down anyway of all of these previous broadcasts. And please subscribe to the podcast, Spotify and Apple, so you can download it. And when you're doing no extra time, you can actually listen to it while you're driving, doing your cleaning, doing your workout, or whatever you're doing, so that you can double up your time as well by listening to that on that podcast. I really appreciate that. If you're enjoying this, I will keep creating content as long as it makes a difference from you and you help me get this message out there, because we're starting to get momentum. Why? Because BlackRock wants to strategically weaken the dollar. So the YouTube algorithm has stopped censoring me, and suddenly the subscribers are now getting notifications because AI is controlling that algorithm. And it looks like in this moment, me revealing the truth is aligned with the agenda. So what does that say about what they want? Why do you think we're getting freedom of speech all of a sudden? We're not necessarily freedom of reach, but when your message aligns with them and AI, suddenly my subscribers go up and my videos get more views, because before they didn't want that. And so please help me get over to 100,000 so I can get the blue check on YouTube. And please follow me on all the different channels, because at some point my message won't be aligned with them and we'll need to go to the backup on simondixon.com and the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Right. We're going to go into the part 3, geopolitics. Please help me put a comment, like, share right now. I'm going to take some water and then we're going to jump into the next section. Okay, welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 80, part 3, where we go through this week in geopolitics. And the Proof of Weapons Network is setting up games. If you haven't watched the macro section in part 2, I go through BlackRock versus the world and how BlackRock has become the new CEO of the Proof of Weapons Network because it controls the most amount of capital. And it's in a game with sovereign countries that have their own sovereign wealth because they utilize their resources to be able to compete. And really, there are 3 different power structures in terms of sovereign wealth. There's more to it, but in terms of the geopolitical section, let's break it down into 3. There is China that leads BRICS because it has a manufacturing base and surplus and sovereign wealth. There is Saudi Arabia that leads the GCC, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council, an alliance between Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, Kuwait, Bahrain. And there is BlackRock, which is essentially has fully co-opted the European economy, the British economy, and the American economy, and right now is engaging in strategic weakening and vassalization through agitating wars and playing certain games. Now, I'd like to go through some of the games that are being played right now so you can understand this power structure now that BlackRock is the CEO of the Proof of Weapons Network that has created a stateless power that supersedes any type of country, any type of president, any type of Congress, any type of Senate, any type of judicial system, and is able to control vast capital in order to deploy the world that is maximizing the profits for their interest. Right. Now let's look at the Middle East. So there is a plethora. I prepared you for this for weeks. I told you that the military-industrial complex would dump Zionism as an ideology. And I started to share with you the moments when this was becoming true. Why? Because there were certain games that were set up. And those games are playing out right now as we speak. They agitated October the 7th in the intelligence network, and the Proof of Weapons Network knew it was going to happen. And they said, look, we're either going to go through a Greater Israel project, a neocon model that Biden was pushing for, or we're going to go for a peaceful Middle East where we split the world up into multipolarity and we allow Saudi Arabia to become a nuclear power, do a nuclear deal, normalize with the region, and repackage the China plan, where you get a Palestinian state, a US exit, and normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, in order to take out the unnatural engineered wars from the region. And because that game was set up, and Netanyahu, who represents the military industrial complex, they had until the next election to win the game. He didn't manage to successfully ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. He ruined the cover of Zionism as a tool for weaponizing religion to get profits to the military industrial complex. And he didn't manage to achieve his goal. Why? Because Egypt did not, and Jordan unified with the GCC and did not take the IMF money that was the bribe in order to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and commit to the Greater Israel project. That did not happen. And then the power structure changed around normalization because BlackRock decided we can make a lot more money splitting the world up into multipolarity than we can by going to World War III, which would have been value destructive for all of us because there are nuclear powers all around the world and competing military forces that makes a very uncertain outcome. So let's not bother with those wars, but we need to recognize that the host states, America, Europe, and UK, and Israel, are going to be asset stripped. And so therefore we need to gain strategic power and partner with BRICS, partner with the GCC. And then they implemented all of the strategic weakening of the dollar, the tariff policy, put Trump in, and strategically gained the vision for the world. So now let's look at what's happening in the Middle East. Essentially, right now, you have a rogue Israel. And so Israel has gone off the grid, essentially. It was originally aligned with the military-industrial complex. And so then you have BlackRock, who are essentially represented by Steve Witkoff, President Trump and the Trump administration. And they're negotiating, and they are aligned with a peaceful Middle East because there is a third player. And that third player is the GCC that I've mentioned, the Gulf Cooperation Council, who are now essentially represented in this moment by Hamas. So while Iran used to back the different type of the new power structure, it was determined that Iran would now align with Saudi Arabia when China, they started working with China and Russia, and China normalized the region. And so Iran was negotiating with Saudi Arabia what the deal looks like. And so therefore, they were backing the Axis, but at some point, they decided that Iran would step back. And so Iran allowed the Syria to be regime changed. They allowed Turkey to back, HTS, that led to renting out of those groups that now you ended up with Jelani in charge. We covered in previous episodes. They allowed the leadership of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Yemen to be somewhat, non-retaliatory. And Saudi Arabia decided to protect and stop Israel bombed by Iran and Israel from bombing Iran. And so Iran got to show and went to the United Nations, submitted an Article 50, said, we are going to show our capabilities to Israel that we could take it out at any stage if we wanted, but we don't want to. But they have illegal nukes, which is why JFK was assassinated. Go through previous episodes. Watch the documentary Numic by Ryan Dawson to understand how they ended up with the illegal nukes. And we want to go into a nuclear deal with America, which is what it did under Obama. And then Trump blew, tore up the nuclear deal. And then we went into the neocon vision into the Biden administration. And then Trump recognized that we need to go back to a nuclear deal because he wanted to do a deal with the banks and BRICS, and BRICS and the banks aligned with the GCC based upon the China plan for normalization in the Middle East. And so they set about regime changing in America and allowing Trump to come through and install his tariff policies. So now we're at that stage. So Iran right now has strategically stepped back and has already normalized with the GCC, which is why this radical change is able to happen. And obviously they're pushing through all of the narratives with Israel, saying Israel's about to bomb Iran and America's going to get into a war with Iran. They need to, push that narrative and make you think that this is happening as well. Now, the game is being played in Gaza. And this is how evil BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons network is. They are currently weaponizing starvation, genocide, ethnic cleansing, because they couldn't ethnically cleanse. And they created a game whereby Israel could get as much money from America under the Trump administration, rearm and go rogue, but use their money to gain as much territory for America so that it could enter into strategic negotiations with the GCC, and it could weaponize death, genocide, babies' life, starvation to gain strategic power as these negotiations are currently happening. And so Israel continues to escalate, and Netanyahu basically represents the military-industrial complex. Trump represents the banking establishment that essentially is aligned with investing in the industry, and they're playing each other off. So Trump and Netanyahu are no longer on the same team. The more that escalates, the more land they conquer, the worse the humanitarian crisis, the more strategic negotiation for America in order to get a better deal when they're negotiating with the GCC. So they're expanding the settlements. They're going further, and they've gone rogue. And what does Netanyahu want? He is no longer aligned with the military-industrial complex because his goal is to not go to prison. Because why do they want to make sure Netanyahu doesn't go to prison? Why is it that important? Because the court system that America set up, the United Nations, to colonize the world, and make sure that no one could fight back through veto voting, turned on itself. The International Criminal Court launched the genocide case against Israel, and Israel is a proxy for American foreign policy with plausible deniability so that they can say, oh, that was Israel, that wasn't us, so that they don't get sued. And so when the American companies like Lockheed Martin, if they're providing the weapons for the genocide, and now the highest court in the world is saying you're a war criminal, you're committing genocide, that means in the future, the military companies can be sued for billions because they enabled that, and there could be reparation payments in the future. And so by setting up this game, you can make it where as long as Netanyahu doesn't go to prison and he gets exile in probably Hungary, then he doesn't need to go to prison. He won't get trialed for the ethnic cleansing, and therefore the military companies don't need to get sued in the future for the fact, and that would create a disaster because now they could no longer weaponize these wars, and all of the previous genocides that have happened over the last 100 years and covert wars could suddenly start coming to the same court. And if Trump leaves the UN, then America can no longer veto vote, and all of this disaster could happen for the companies that would need to take all the billions and billions and trillions of profits that they made through exporting terrorism around the world, and they could end up having to pay that. And BlackRock definitely doesn't want that. So it needs Netanyahu to have safe passage and safe exit. But the GCC essentially wants to move towards peace, and peace is required to have a Palestinian state. And so by making sure that Netanyahu never returns the hostages, you can keep creating atrocities and eventually negotiate with the Trump administration that is now aligned because he works for the banks that want to invest in a peaceful Middle East and invest in a new BRICS corridor. So you can play all these players off against each other. And America wants to get as much investment as it can in the region. Trump gets to build his Trump Towers in Qatar. And the Middle East wants to invest in much in AI and robotics. And the last assets of America so that it can actually have foreign direct investment. And this is all about switching the capital flows, the resources, based upon the games that are happening. So at the moment, America and the GCC are on the same page, aligned with the banks. And so GCC doesn't want to give up too much power. And so you're seeing the military industrial complex go to other regions and get as much as they can out of Netanyahu before he is regime changed, knowing that eventually the GCC is going to buy all of the real estate in distress, buy all the settler colonies, install a region that it was before Britain turned it into this settler colonial imperial project that was so bad for the Jewish people. The Jewish people that lived there were fine. They lived in peace with the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews. And there was nothing saying that after the Holocaust that the Jews couldn't go to Palestine. But what they couldn't do is they couldn't ethnically cleanse, genocide, kill, rape, massacre, and steal, and create a state, for the criminal activities of the British Empire, the CIA, and this criminal network that was created. And you weren't able to do that. They weren't okay with that. But that's what weaponized and created all the problems. So if the GCC is in charge and America goes, then you could end up with a good place and safe place for Jews to work with Muslim, to live side by side with Muslims and Christians. And those that are de-radicalized, you can actually make the GCC a nuclear power that is normalized. And how do you do that? You strategically weaken Israel, economically destroy its economy, set fires off, get its insurance premiums up, make it where the price of real estate crashes, where it can't borrow, use the same tactics that America always used on the global south against Israel. And that's currently what's happening. And then you weaken its reputation and you get plausible deniability saying, no, it wasn't us. It was because the Jews rule the world. And AIPAC did that. And all the things that were true under a different world order, but now they can switch it because it was the American Jewish people that were funding AIPAC. And AIPAC was funded by the military industrial complex. And the big lobbies were the banking lobby, the pharma lobby, the military industrial complex, and the Israeli lobby. But it's the big lobbies that are controlling the agenda right now because there's a more profitable model. Why? Because MBS from Saudi Arabia and MBZ from UAE managed to beat the West economically while China set up this game, and they all aligned together in order to finally decolonize and beat the dollar. And so while originally Iran was funding Hamas, Hamas now represent the GCC, where Iran and Saudi Arabia are aligned, and they're aligned with US. And now Israel has become a rogue state while Netanyahu tries to negotiate its freedom for the military industrial complex. Get how these games work? Once you understand this, then you realize everything they're telling you is a lie, and all you need to do is follow the money, and you can understand the monetary flows. Essentially, peace in the Middle East is a more profitable model, but the military industrial complex needs to make up for its lost profits somewhere else, and it needs to make sure it doesn't get sued, which is why Netanyahu has to make sure that he doesn't get sued for all the crimes against humanity and everything that is happening. So essentially, they can try and get as much contracts as possible in the last bit of wars, and they can fund as much of it with US taxpayers. So Trump essentially sent $12 billion from its $6 billion budget. It got approved when trying to approve the $1.3 trillion and push off the debt ceiling increase to September. But because Trump, and Netanyahu together could not pull off the ethnic cleansing, they can still push a narrative saying that, we'll still try and get Egypt to do it. But Egypt is aligned with the GCC. The power structure has changed. And they're trying to get as much finance into the GCC and negotiate with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. That's what's happening right now when you follow the money. And so Trump is going to be personally visiting those regions, allowing them to invest in the last assets of America through AI and robotics, and trying to get deals for his Trump Towers and the crypto industry, and how stable coins are going to change the capital markets, and how Bitcoin can be utilized. And that is the negotiations, as well as thinking about how do you control inflation in the oil markets through OPEC plus. But Trump doesn't have the cards. That's the reality right now. He does have some cards. Saudi and the GCC still want to manage this relationship. There's an amazing opportunity to create capital markets, to have peace in the Middle East, to invest in America, invest in China, be brokers in the region, decolonize Africa, end some of the atrocities that UAE is committing that is killing the Sudanese at the moment, end some of those games, allow for investments in the global south. And all of that is being negotiated. And it knows that in order to get there, it requires a ceasefire. And Saudi has always, for the last decade, said you have to have a Palestinian state in order to normalize. And the only way to get there is to end the US colonial dominance through its proxy Israel. And so in return, they're prepared to basically pour foreign direct investment into America, help them refinance their debt. And so all of these negotiations are about how do we sell our assets in exchange for debt, and then recognize that we can facilitate the transition to multipolarity while we become an AI and robotics technocracy. This is essentially the ongoing asset stripping that we saw in Europe and UK, but for America. And it is for the benefit of the banks. And so they need certain strategic leverage. And the leverage is weaponizing starvation and genocide. That's what's happening right now. This is why, if you're defending your government that works for this network, don't believe that when they become stateless, like they are right now, they won't use the same tactics against you. I've already seen it. Now, Israel is economically broken right now. It is completely annihilated and destroyed in terms of economics, in terms of reputation, and it is in a fight for its survival. And so Trump can also recognize that as well. That can give and enhance his strategic negotiation position. And this is the reality. They negotiate. There is no humanity in this process. Over 60 days of weaponizing starvation, blowing up hospitals, taking out all infrastructure, weaponizing access to clean water, forcing humanitarian aid not to get in, and then blaming it, saying that Hamas is stealing it, and trying to create a narrative that makes this acceptable to people in the West, so you can radicalize their interests because they're going to listen to your state propaganda rather than actually follow the money. And there is still massive profit to be made if you can win these negotiations. Some point, this is going to end. But you're starting to see massive, strategic negotiation for the banks, starting to see Trump getting additional deals that you can visually see. You can see that there's additional deals for the arms industry, and they're negotiating this. And the US, through its proxy, is weaponizing the starvation, and Israel's gone off on its own path right now as well. And so they're ready to crash Zionism as an ideology because it is no longer useful to the military industrial complex, because money has no humanity. And all of you believing that this is, based upon some kind of religious ideology, that's how they get people to fight and justify the dehumanizing and genocidal acts that are happening right now. But although I cannot stand watching every single day what is still happening to this day, Palestine will be free. The Gulf Cooperation Council do have the cards. Egypt stood strong in order to not allow that to happening. And the GCC is investing in the region to take away the IMF power and the IMF strategic leverage, and then negotiating foreign direct investment into the best assets in America so that it can have more control over the region, while BlackRock, that controls those regions, is trying to get as much leverage as it can, so that it can invest in as many deals as possible, and it can decide where the next military profits go. Where do they go? Of course, you need to create a terrorist attack in Pakistan against some tourist and agitate India, and you need to get some money and say, good cop, bad cop. America is negotiating with Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine signs the rare earth deals, and now you hand over the war to Europe to strategically weaken Europe, print $1 trillion, and carry on the death of Ukrainians in order to get more and more land in Ukraine for BlackRock as it fights BRICS and Russia, led by China. And you have all of the ability through Trump's narratives to negotiate the ports where BlackRock owns the ports versus China owning those ports in those different narratives. So nothing is going to work for the Americans, the Europeans, and the Brits. It's all going to be for BlackRock and BlackRock's portfolio companies. That's why you got an announcement of assigned rare earth deals for Elon Musk, for EV batteries, that uses technology from the military industrial complex to create a social credit score and a stable coin in order to surveil the American people while it beta tests civil unrest by taking away First Amendment rights, by taking student protesters that are saying, hey, endowment funds, we don't want you to invest in war. And then they use the terrorist act to say you're a Hamas supporter. And then they use the colored revolutions, like with Black Lives Matter, in order to weaponize riots to fund militia groups within America, and then send those people off to El Salvador prisons, lock them up, never to be seen again, and open up Guantanamo Bay. And you can then test and beta test what they did with Europe when they took away freedom of speech, and implement laws like the anti-Semitism law that essentially says there's a protective class and you're allowed to say whatever you want about white people, black people, about Jewish people, Muslim people, not Jewish people, Christian people, about Americans, but you can't say anything about the Jewish people. This is gaslighting narratives that they know will create civil unrest. And so what happens in India? So BlackRock is all over the India-Pakistani conflict. It is essentially, you're being told that this is because the Brits left Kashmir, left it in distress in 1947, all true, divide and conquered, created all sorts of religious battles, weaponized terrorism that was all funded by Western forces, entered into a Cold War battle in order to control the poppy fields and the drug trade by funding the Mujahideen, which were the precursors to the Taliban that turned into ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which were always Western controlled, fund those networks in order to gain access to the black op drug dealing operations so that you could continue to get Americans addicted to drugs, and push those Afghan wars, those Pakistani wars, those things. And then you just put in a false flag operation, and all of a sudden you create carnage, control the media. Suddenly the Israeli military industrial complex is sending drones over to Modi. And now they get to fund themselves independent of America, while American contractors have made billions and billions of dollars. And BlackRock now gets to swoop in. And the longer that India goes to war, the more it can vassalize, do securitization, and create debt dependency into BlackRock and the military industrial complex. So essentially, India, BlackRock, and China, which was decolonizing the IMF model through the Belt and Road Initiative and strategically investing in Pakistan to build its infrastructure, and a CIA operation called Overthrow the Government put Imran Khan in prison, just like they did in Bangladesh when the CIA funded the regime change within Bangladesh. You suddenly see all of these, different games for BlackRock. And so that they can gain access for their portfolio companies and weaponize the wars whenever they need to. So Pakistan has essentially become a vassal state for China interests. And the longer this goes on for, the more China's going to be able to double in and set them up as in their Belt and Road Initiative. Now, India is being squeezed at every angle through conflict by strengthening, essentially, basically China's economic power over Pakistan, which is a strategic route. And then you can try and create strategic weakness between BRICS, India, and China. And so while China gets more power over Pakistan, you then give more power to BlackRock over India, so that when BlackRock wants to agitate any kind of disruption within BRICS, they're swimming with sharks because they had to align with BlackRock to set up this new deal and enter into this peaceful Middle Eastern world. And all of those games are being played right now. And so the more you can get and push up the narrative between India and Pakistan, the more autonomy India needs to give up for BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network. So BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network is doing in India what it did in Ukraine. But the difference is that this time they're doing it with Modi's money rather than America's money. And so Ukraine was basically stealing wealth from the American people in that proxy war. Now it's stealing wealth from the Indian people and radicalizing the Indians in order to think that you can play the Hindu Muslim caste system in order to create the civil unrest you need to get the law changes, to get the media shut down. Media's all being shut down across India. Now, remember when Elon Musk did that for Brazil? Because it wasn't in line with BlackRock's agenda, he went crazy saying Brazil is going to take, we're going to ban Twitter within Brazil, because Brazil was defending itself for BRICS because they tried to vassalize BRICS, and now they moved over to India because they need as much power as they can over BRICS, because they don't have central banks that can be taken over, but India does and Brazil does. And so that's how the exploitation works. They're doing it on two main fronts. One is through debt slavery, the IMF model. The other is through military, by sending as much money as possible and boosting the profits of Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and Raytheon, because they're no longer got a profit center in the Middle East, because MBS has more power controlling that. So the banks will offer massive loans and massive investment infrastructure into India. Modi will take assets from the Indian people, privatize, securitize, and do what America did to its people, Europe did to its people, and Britain did to its people. And there will be big investments, and more money will move over to India to create growth. It will create that arbitrage economy so that Silicon Valley can fund through H-1B visas, and the artificial intelligence isn't going to be built by, Americans. It's going to be built by Indians. And then you get to have these trade agreements. You get to create racial tension whenever you want, because you're fixing the demographic issue, because Americans are no longer having children because birth rates are at its lowest, as it is in Europe, as it is. So you need people that are still having children to come in, but then you can also make it look like an invasion so that you can all of a sudden change laws whenever you need to. And so BlackRock can do this and give itself as many tools as possible when you want to asset strip all of the assets away. So basically, BlackRock wants India to align with their companies, their portfolio companies, buy from them. And now you've got this being done, not at the state level, but at the stateless level. And that is the new model. It is not controlled by a central bank. It is controlled by sovereign wealth fighting against the stolen, confiscated wealth of the Proof of Weapons Network that currently BlackRock is the CEO of. And then you can open up their markets to Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. You can then take American pensions. You can redirect the ETFs into emerging markets, and you can create growth that BlackRock controls, asset strip, decide that you want to utilize the country just for their capital and power. And whenever you need to cause conflict, you can do that. And that is the model. It was taught by the British Empire, handed over to the American Empire, that then turned on itself and handed over to the stateless entity with BlackRock as CEO in what I call the proof of weapons network. And invested in, I went in macro. I just say the word BlackRock because they got the most power. Go back to part 2 in the macro section to understand the different players that are involved in this. And so the goal is to just make India 100% cash dependent and military dependent upon foreign forces, so that when it wants to have stability, when it doesn't want stability, when it wants it to make it harder to compete, it can do that just like it's done through the IMF in the past. And the debt means that India's leaders basically have to work for the military industrial complex, BlackRock, and the different agendas in this game. And so it's no longer sovereign. And the longer it goes for, the more sovereignty it loses. Okay. On the defense side, you can get all the contracts from the military industrial complex. You can do it with the Indian rupee that is now buying and purchasing in a foreign currency rather than using dollars. And you get to enhance de-dollarization for BRICS, while Trump is saying that he's supporting, dollarization and the world reserve currency. You can make sure that all of the different missile jets and everything is purchased. You can do billions of sales. I think India is already spending approximately $80 billion annually through BlackRock portfolio companies. And so all you need is a little bit of tension with Pakistan, and you can meet your quota, because the military is coming out of the Middle East. And so it needs to go to Europe and India. And now, unfortunately, to get this multipolar world order, they need, the BRICS and the GCC blocks need to manage how to work with this stateless entity that has no humanity. And they do that by remaining sovereign and not having an investment bank and not privatizing its resources, now that the IMF can't force that upon people. But of course, the tariff policy means that you can take the export countries that I covered in macro, like Venezuela, like the different countries, and try and not get them to join BRICS and instead become vassalized states for BlackRock. And that's what's happening right now. I hope when you follow the money, you get to see how the world works. What else have I got for you? I think we're coming towards the end. Now, India will never be able to outcompete China in this side. So this benefits China the weaker India becomes. But then it needs to align with BlackRock. And so you're entering into that environment where you're swimming with sharks. And so the games begin. They set the game again. That helps the military industrial complex and all the different players. That's the way the game works. Okay. What else have I got? So I think I covered the Ukraine rare earth deals. We know what's happening there. They're being vassalized for BlackRock, weakening Europe. We went through the India-Pakistan stuff. We went through the GCC and the Middle East and BRICS and BlackRock. And so what do we have to look forward to next week? Well, Trump, what's he now doing? As he shorts the dollar, as he takes the funding from ICBC, as he invests with GCC, he needs to get his next negotiations through. As he works for BlackRock in order to ensure that trade deals work for corporate interest so they can consolidate and get more wealth. As he weakens the dollar and shrinks the economy and manages those capital outflows, he gets to invest alongside those other people. And now he needs to head over to the Middle East next week so that he can say, I created peace in the Middle East and I deserve a Nobel Peace Prize. Look, it is a reality that Biden's model, and this is why, if you remember back when I said you have to vote for Trump, because firstly, you can't allow Holocaust Harris and Genocide Joe that profited from the neocon model driving us to World War III to benefit. I said, under Trump, at least you get a Bitcoin strategic reserve strategy and you can build your independent wealth. You also get a game that puts the world into a solution, and you can have an alignment between the banks and the Trump administration that doesn't rely upon World War III. And if you can end up with a non-neocon model, then we could end up having peace in the Middle East and various other regions. And I went down and I broke down all the tools. And that's why I told everyone to vote for Trump. But I said, I'll criticize everything he does so that you can protect yourself at the same time. I'm consistent. I'm humanity first. When this was all about saying things you like, I said all the things you like when that was the reality of the world. The world has changed and you need to change. So you either say, I don't want the world to be like this, and so I'm going to demonize Simon when he's telling me how the world is, or you don't just recognize that we're engaging in good faith, then you can either get eaten up, gobbled alive, and bury your head in the sand, or you can adjust to the new reality and recognize the BlackRock is more powerful than Trump, Starmer, the European Union. And they don't give a shit about you. And so therefore you need to protect yourself. The way we protect ourselves is by defanging debt, saving in Bitcoin, and spending local, supporting decentralization and new community structures, state-level Bitcoin strategic reserves, resistance against the European Union, the European Central Bank. And if we can't influence the political process, we look after ourselves, we look after our families, and we go into supporting decentralization, because this evil empire is going to be disrupted by AI. Their technology is going to turn on themselves. The central banks ain't going to be able to, it's not going to pick their CBDC. It's going to pick Bitcoin. The governments aren't going to be able to collect taxes in the future. In the next 10 years, when they want you on universal basic income, the world will split into those that have Bitcoin and those that are on universal basic income, because they listened to their government and they allowed their government to trick them into thinking they represent themselves. Now, look, even if I'm wrong, carry on with your belief. But my belief is that I'm not wrong, and I got a track record of calling it before everyone else. And everyone else will tell you when it happens, but I'm trying to protect you before it happens. And even if I'm wrong, I'll admit when I'm wrong. And if I admit when I'm wrong, and I don't think I'm wrong about this one, at least you would have protected yourself, and you can come back to me and say, Simon, I told you so. They had my back. They rebuilt the manufacturing base. They made America great again. But I'll say, and I'll put to you, that this future of rebuilding the world and you being involved in it and decentralizing it is a much better world to live in. Multipolarity and competition is better. Why would you take the BlackRock model and support our politicians in allowing the hegemon power to never compete? That's what you're doing when you have this patriotism, because you don't know who your government works for. Now, isn't it more exciting to accept that by allowing the dollar to strategically weaken, we can actually rebuild a competitive model with Bitcoin as decentralized money, and we can rebuild everything where it actually works for people? Because tell me, when I went to America, and I've been all across America, when I saw what they do to their people in LA, the drug addiction, the mental illness, the homelessness, the wars, the PTSD, the trauma, the low birth rates, it reminded me exactly of why I left UK. And I had to go seek an island so that I could work on forces and building economic power and be engaging in the real battle, decentralization versus centralization. It reminded me exactly of what they did to our country and what they're doing to Europe. So America, like EU, like UK, you've seen the model, you've seen the beta test. My bet is they're doing it to you right now. And if you think that they're working on MAGA and you don't protect yourself, then I think you're going to be sorely mistreated by BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network. they'll put you on UBI. And if you disobey, they'll use their social credit score and they'll use their AI, artificial intelligence warfare that they're currently using in the Middle East. They'll make some profits by selling it and using it on you. Our governments don't work for our people. We created this model. I spent my whole career warning against the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve model, and the privatization of money. I wrote books on how to do it. I create video series on how to do it. I tried to work with governments. And in the end, the only thing that worked was Bitcoin. And the only thing that I've learned of how did China gain that power, how did Saudi gain that power, is because they beat them at their own game and they became economically powerful. And that's the only way you win, because their money is controlled by us at the end of the day. And we need to find out how we're going to harness this technology and artificial intelligence and share this journey together, because our decentralized power is more powerful than them as we can build our communities. We've got decentralized money. We've got distributed supercomputers. We got Bitcoin. We've got this because the military industrial complex is ready to dump Zionism right now. You see what they do. You thought Zionism was almighty and all powerful. It's lost its economic power because it's lost the dollar and it's lost its support from America. So what have you seen ever since BlackRock decided that it doesn't care about Zionism anymore? It doesn't care. What have you seen? Trump posted a video by Jeffrey Sachs calling Netanyahu a deep, dark son of a bitch. What else did Trump do? Trump states that Netanyahu won't drag the US into a war with Iran. That would never have happened. Trump pursues negotiations with Iran instead of Israel's requests to bomb the Iranian nuclear sites. Trump then files a national security advisor, fires the national security advisor Waltz over the close association with Netanyahu. Then Trump makes peace with Yemen. In terms of Ansar Allah, remember what I said? I warned you against this all along. The only way that they can win that war is ground invasion. Ansar Allah is serious force. They've been bombed for years by America and Saudi Arabia via proxy. And what did they do? America came in, blew parts of them up. They came back and they got a bomb and missile into Tel Aviv to say, you're not going to take us down. Why? Because Iran has stepped back and the GCC is controlling the axes to enter into a negotiation, because Zionism is being dumped right now and America's going to do a strategic retreat, become a power. And what else did we see? Ansar Allah is basically allowing Israeli ships to continue being targeted, and America's not stopping it anymore. Israeli media reports that Trump cut off contact between Netanyahu over reportedly being being treated with disrespect, and Trump's Secretary of Defense arbitrarily cancels his meeting with Israel while he goes to meet Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and starts pushing forward a nuclear deal with Iran, while it says there's going to be a nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia. And what is that nuclear deal going to look like? It's going to be a two-state solution where Palestine is free and economically Israel is weakened, so that those nukes that Israel took over, regime change of Netanyahu, an installment of their own government, and that government will take those nukes and make them to Saudi Arabia and put it under inspection and end this Zionism, multi-trillion-dollar military industrial complex, crimes against humanity, genocidal apartheid regime, and return it to a peaceful place where the Jewish, the Christians, and the Muslims don't have this unnatural force always creating strategic tension because the US is going to retreat because they got freed from the colonization of the dollar. And now they're approving Yemen to negotiate with the GCC. And there's still humanitarian crises to resolve. But the world is changing because the Jewish conspiracy was always a weapon that Israel and the Zionists use at the highest level in order to sacrifice the Jewish people, to radicalize them. And Zionism was always awful for the Jewish people. They were willing to get you to engage in ethnically cleansing, dehumanizing you, and sacrifice you at the altar, just as they did during World War II. And that wasn't the Muslims that did that. The fake war on terror was another manufactured narrative. Evangelical Christianity, another manufactured narrative, because the military-industrial complex and the banks and the forces that are now essentially have BlackRock and Larry Fink as their CEO have no humanity, have no care for religious ideology, and they will dump Zionism as soon as Zionism is no longer useful. And America will use plausible deniability because they work for the military-industrial complex, and the military-industrial complex doesn't want to be sued for the crimes against humanity. And so therefore Netanyahu will probably get exiled and won't be trialed. But I'll accept that now the world can liberate themselves from the dollar, and we can enter into a region that we've never seen before. And that's exciting. Getting involved in the rebuild in a more decentralized world, a more multipolar world, knowing that we have Bitcoin to regulate the regulator and hold them accountable, and recognize that we're in a fight between centralization and decentralization, and we are in bed with sharks. BlackRock owns shitloads of Bitcoin, but Satoshi designed it where you could still own your own Bitcoin. You could still send your own money without BlackRock, and nobody can change that monetary policy, so you can outperform everything that BlackRock tries to do with your money, as it tries to get and engineer a pump and dump scheme in order to use borrowing against your Bitcoin through Cantor Fitzgerald and create SPAC public companies with SoftBank and the Bank of Japan, so that it can then take Cantors and Tether and plug them all together so you can borrow against your Bitcoin, so that you over leverage, so that when the second they want to pump the price of Bitcoin and dump the price of Bitcoin short term, they can engineer what they did last time, what they did and what led to Majinsky being recommended by the Department of Justice to have 20 years in prison, stealing people's Bitcoin because you levered up and you used the proof of weapons network when you had the perfect asset all along. Hard money with no interest that meets the criteria for allowing for the whole free market you thought you had in the first place, but the Federal Reserve took away and put you into a debt-based Ponzi scheme with fake capitalism and a fake democracy. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Many are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do well. Own more Bitcoin this month than last month. Learn how to do self-custody. And I'll be releasing some education on that journey. Join me at simondixon.com. Get a free membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. And please, if you get anything out of this, please share this with your family. Please like, subscribe, hit the comments, retweet it, engage with me. I'm going to hit 100,000 subscribers soon because we've entered into the end of the censorship campaign. As long as you hit the like button, hit the comments, and support me, and I'll answer some of your questions, and it will help me to make better content as well. Because I'd rather do this thing with peace, love, and unity, and we can have decentralization fight back against BlackRock and the proof of weapons network with peaceful Bitcoin proof of work. Peace.